We might be a small island, but we've got a big history. Everywhere you stand, there are worlds beneath your feet. And so every year, hundreds of archaeologists across Britain go looking for more clues. Who lived here, when, and how?
You can even see the architecture of the bone inside the jaw there.
Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, temples to treasure.
She's got a very cartoon-like face, hasn't she?
From Orkney to Devon, we're joining this year's quest on sea, land and air. We'll share all of the questions and find some of the answers as we join the teams in the field, digging for Britain. From Roman times, the mystery of a man buried face down on a bed of meat. A fabulous treasure trove of coins dedicated to ancient gods. And the shocking evidence of 97 murdered babies buried beneath this field. I'm heading towards a place close to Hadrian's Wall where archaeologists are finding signs of that Roman influence writ large. This narrow road with its passing places is known locally as the Stone Gate. It's one of hundreds of similar roads which crisscross this part of northern England. But what makes this one stand out is that it was once the northern frontier of the entire Roman Empire. And guarding the central section of the Stone Gate, that important east-west supply route, was the fort of Vindolanda. Each year, from April to mid-September, an army of over 500 archaeology volunteers comes here from all over the world. And every week they make new discoveries.
What you've got there, John, is a beautiful, great big dark blue glass melon bead. And there's a bit of a debate about those, because some people think that Roman soldiers just simply wore these as decorations, or ladies wore them as decorations. Right. It's a very, very corroded lump of metal. But what we've actually got here is the back of a helmet, by the looks of things. It's very, very badly bashed, but you sort of see it on the side profile. Oh, yeah. This is the neck guard at the back, and this is the start of the top of the helmet coming up.
Vindolanda has been excavated for over 40 years, but they estimate they've only uncovered 15% of it, and that it would take another 150 years to finish the job, which is utterly remarkable because the site as it stands is absolutely massive.
Vindolanda was bought in 1929 by the renowned archaeologist Professor Eric Burley. His grandson Andrew is now its director of excavations.
Site, but the Romans built 4 forts here by the time Hadrian's Wall was built. So
oh really? So the first ones predate the wall?
Predate the wall by a good 40 years, and they're a long way down. They're 7 or 8 metres beneath where we're standing.
And would they have been stone built?
No, the first 6 forts here are built in timber, and the last 3 are in stone. And so they knock them down, build them up, knock them down, build them up very, very quickly. So in perhaps only 125 years, you get the landscape really shooting up to the fort we're standing in at the moment.
So this is the last fort. There's an enormous amount of it still in place.
It's because 9 forts have been built right on top of each other here that so much archaeological evidence survives.
In just the last couple of weeks, the team working here have uncovered this wonderful flagstone street, which leads from the northern gate of the fort straight up to the headquarters building. And the stones are really worn with centuries of use, and you can just imagine the sound of those hobnailed boots as the Roman soldiers marched in and out of the fort.
As well as the excavations within the walls of the stone fort, this year a separate team is working in the Vicus, the civilian village which lies just outside the garrison here at Vindolanda.
So what are you excavating here?
Well, it's all part of the the garrison settlement that sprang up outside the last stone fort that was built at Vindolanda. So it's a combination of sort of workshops, shops and houses, sort of wagon parks and trading areas to supply and sort of, you know, link in with the fort there. So that it was a bit like retail world outside there. We had all sorts of shops flanking the roads. A little bit of evidence for a pub as well. We had a building on there where we found a room right on the street front there, and inside that room all the artefacts that we found were basically drinking beakers and game encounters. So
Fantastic.
yeah, it's one of those sites where you can almost be there as well. You can virtually hear the Romans when you're digging, because there's so many artefacts come from the ground and you've got all these buildings that are in really super condition.
For the past 3 weeks, Justin and his team have been working on a cobbled roadway which ran through the heart of the Roman village.
We've been really very lucky with this one because we actually got some super dating evidence, because trapped in among the cobbles we actually found a little silver denarius of Severus Alexander, which was minted in AD 222.
Right.
So of course, because it was trapped in the road surface, it means that the road surface can't really have been made before that coin was minted, so we've got a super date for it.
Just beside the Roman fort is the conservation area, where the daily finds are taken to Barbara Burley and her team. Are all of these artefacts coming out this year?
Most of them are, yes.
Oh, this is amazing. This
Yes.
little griffin.
Just pull it out and have a little bit closer look. You can see it's got the fabulous wings here, and you can actually just make out the detail of the feathers. And then he's got the hindquarters there of a lion. And the Romans had a lot of superstitious beliefs. They felt that this type of being would have been very good for protecting maybe something precious and things like gold or treasure. So we know that he's a little statue, but we don't know what he was possibly guarding.
The village of Hambledon near the Thames has always been a desirable place to live. Even so it seems for the Romans who built villas here. I'm just up from the river now and walking along on the edge of this beautiful field, which seems to be growing some kind of cereal crop. But it's not the crop I'm interested in at all. It's what's in the ground underneath it. Almost exactly 100 years ago, this woman, Miss Glassbrook, was walking along in this very same field and started to find some strange pieces of pottery, very much like these ones. And she decided they were worth further investigation. Miss Glassbrook approached a local archaeologist who in 1912 would make an extraordinary discovery beneath the soil in this Buckinghamshire field. The archaeologist Alfred Cox had discovered the foundations of a high-status Roman villa, which he would call Euden. Over the course of a year, Cox would excavate and photograph the villa while collecting the finds. But in doing so, he would uncover a dark secret, which is still troubling archaeologists almost a century later.
The main villa house is what we see in this photograph, and there's a little bump in the middle of the field here, and the bump is entirely due to that building beneath the surface. But it's quite nice, you can work out where you are, and you know it's that bump because you can actually see the scene in front of you.
You've got that house there, which has got a white front on it, a right gable end.
That's right.
It's now pebble dashed, isn't it? But
Pebble
that's
dashed,
it, isn't it?
That's right.
This is a huge excavation.
It is massive. He had to have a huge team of labourers to dig this. It was all by hand, so all by shovel and wheelbarrows, and so that would have been a huge labour force and an enormous cost.
So this is all still there underneath that
Still
wheat?
there, just it's got all the backfill, then the soil layer reinstated, and of course crops on it forevermore.
For many years, the finds from Euden Roman Villa were kept in a special museum at Hambledon. But when that closed in the 1950s, they were moved to Buckinghamshire County Museum in Aylesbury, where, appropriately enough, Alfred Cox was once curator. Cox published his results in 1921, but it's the way he reached his conclusions that's interesting archaeologists today. Alfred Cox was unlike most of the antiquarian archaeologists operating in the early 20th century, many of whom are, to be honest, just treasure hunters. But Cox was different. He paid careful attention to each and every find. He labelled them with the name, the location, and even the precise depth at which they were found. The artefacts from the 1912 excavation fill over 300 boxes. So, Brett, all of these boxes here are from Uden, are they?
Absolutely.
Brett Thorne is Keeper of Archaeology at the Buckinghamshire County Museum.
But this is all of the objects he recovered from the 1912 excavations. And these, as you can see, these are Roman brooches.
But he's not just collecting the brooches, there are little pieces of just random bits of metal here as well.
Exactly. He didn't differentiate. He just picked up absolutely everything.
Not only did he collect even the tiniest little cruddy bit, like that little section there, he labelled everything, even these tiny pieces.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of show you an example, if I show you this one, this rather crude bit of card.
Is that Cox's writing?
This is Cox's handwriting, yeah. East side of yard, 35 inches north of east of enclosure wall, Uden, and the date, 2/10/12. So this is his original display piece.
Fantastic. So this must be really unusual for the time.
Hugely unusual. I mean, these antiquarians just went in and dug. They just took out the goodies, the pretty items to put on show, and they weren't interested in anything else. All these little bits of bronze wire, little tiny sherds of pot where the label is actually bigger than the pot piece. They wouldn't have kept that. They'd have just dumped it all back on site, completely wrecked the stratigraphy. We wouldn't know anything about the site.
There's so much more information available to you now.
Yeah.
Because he's done this work, because he's been so careful, so meticulous.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Over the past year, Jill has been taking home the Hambledon boxes to re-evaluate Cox's 1912 findings with the eye and the techniques of the 21st century archaeologist. But there was one particular set of remains which Alfred Cox was uncharacteristically reticent about.
Well, in Cox's report, he obviously tells us about a good number of the finds selectively. He doesn't discuss all the finds. And I was rather surprised to find in his report that in actual fact he did find 97 infant burials. Now, he only gives them a paragraph or so of a mention, which, you know, even in 1912, that's a very important find. It's an unusually high number. And it was rather odd the way he just described them rather informally as being wrapped as little bundles and potentially buried secretly after dark.
So a tiny little bag here of, little infant bones.
Absolutely minute, beautifully preserved though.
The bone is incredibly well preserved, and you've got some little pieces of skull there, which is, I mean, it's almost eggshell-like, isn't it? It's incredibly thin, but brilliantly preserved. The infant bones were thought to have been lost until last year, when Jill and Brett rediscovered them, packed away in old cigar and gun cartridge boxes. How many infants were there buried at Uden?
Well, that was the key thing. We've got 97. I mean, it's an astounding number for the one villa.
It's quite a shocking number, actually.
It is,
Yeah.
And it's actually quite normal to have infant burials. You're not considered to be a proper human being ready for the cemetery until you're about 2 years old in the Roman world. So you do bury any babies that are lost between being born and 2 years, and you put them in the garden or in the yard or perhaps even under your floor.
But this number?
But not 97. There's something different about Uden.
There's something very strange going on there, isn't there? So these are the boxes, are they, that the bones were kept in?
This is how Cox packed them. Cigarette boxes, all with his detailed notes on about where that particular infant was buried, and again the date and all of the information that he loved to record. But it's strange.
But what doesn't seem in keeping is the fact that he squirrels these away and doesn't really look at them again.
There's no mention anywhere in the published report of them other than a short paragraph saying Cox thought because the bodies kind of cut and recut each other, they're buried in a very small area, that he thought it must have been done surreptitiously after dark and hidden. I do handle human bones, obviously, but this is the first time I've really had to deal with infant bones, and it's quite a strange feeling, isn't it?
It actually quite upset me because they are obviously very small skeletons and they were clearly very young babies, so it just has that effect on you.
Nearly a century after Alfred Cox first discovered them, the infant bones are once again coming under scientific scrutiny, this time by Dr. Simon Mays.
It's quite common to find a handful of burials at Roman villa sites, but But what is unusual is to come across quite so many. There's no other site that's yielded anything like the 97 infant burials that we've got from Hambledon. Something that struck me as I laid out skeleton after skeleton was they all seemed to be a pretty similar size. The best way to determine how old an infant was when they died is to measure the bones. We measure the bones of the arms and legs. By doing this, we can age an infant to within about 2 weeks.
Simon's measurements confirmed his initial hunch. The babies looked the same size because they'd all died around the same age, of 40 weeks gestation.
So it seems what we're dealing with is infants that died around time of birth.
If this was natural infant mortality, there would be a wide range of bone size, but this wasn't the case.
And that made us think that perhaps these individuals were being deliberately killed.
The shocking evidence is suggesting infanticide. At Euden Villa, the Romans were murdering their newborn children.
I think the fact that we've got 97 infants makes us look for something systematic that was going on.
In the coming months, Simon will carry out further tests on the bones of those babies once buried beneath this Buckinghamshire field. These investigations may shed light on the motives behind these awful killings.
It seems like there's something quite disturbing going on here, because to some extent we expect to see this. We know that infanticide was there in Roman society, but at this scale, what's happening?
The Roman army just happened to coincidentally be just over the hill. There's a track, in fact, leading off in that direction towards where we know there's a Roman road and, in fact, a Roman army encampment for some time. The only explanation you keep coming back to is it's got to have been a brothel.
Really?
It really is the only explanation. You can think of all sorts of wealth of other reasons, but they just don't hold water.
But at the moment, the story of Euden Roman Villa hasn't been told in all its fullness, has it?
Absolutely not. And that is just my opinion. I have no proof of that theory, of course, but it's one that works for the moment. I'm going to continue investigating it.
100 miles away in Kent, there are new investigations into the beginnings of Roman rule, almost exactly where the Emperor Claudius invaded these shores.
In the year 43 AD, the people living here on the Kent coast looking out to sea would have been greeted by the sight of an armada of ships approaching. It was almost 100 years since Julius Caesar had first invaded these shores, and the Romans were back. This time, they were here to stay.
Just half a mile away from where the Roman army came ashore, we're getting a glimpse into the Britain of the 1st century. And it's all thanks to an £87 million road being built here in Kent. 6 miles long and covering 100 acres, it's the last part of a road project linking the Channel Tunnel and coastal ports to the motorway network beyond.
The new road here cuts right across a part of the country that is incredibly rich in archaeological terms, because for thousands of years this tip of Kent, jutting out into the English Channel, has been the gateway to Britain, not just for the Romans arriving in 43 AD, but for those who preceded them and those who would come much later. Archaeologically speaking, this place is something of a gold mine.
For the last few months, Digging for Britain has been following the teams from Oxford Wessex Archaeology. They've been tasked with excavating and recording the evidence uncovered by the diggers and bulldozers, before the ground is once again covered up, this time by a 4-lane highway. The entire length of the new road has been carefully stripped by earth-moving equipment, removing the topsoil without damaging the archaeology below.
Andrew, this is a massive area of excavation, but this is only a small part of the whole scheme.
It's a very small bit. This is the biggest dig in Britain this year. It's a road scheme just over 6 miles long, but it's one big archaeological site. Almost every single bit is an archaeological excavation.
And how many archaeologists have you got working here at any one time?
At the moment, there are about 130 archaeologists on site, but working in the offices, backing them up, there are others, so about 150 people.
So you've got this big new road being built, and all the way along the length of it, archaeology has to happen first.
It is. It's one of these bittersweet opportunities that the archaeology will be destroyed, but the sweetness is that we get the opportunity to make a record and to investigate about this part of the archaeology of East Kent.
Turn the clock back 2,000 years, and this part of Kent where the new road is being built would have looked very different. Then the Isle of Thanet really was an island, separated from the mainland until medieval times by a stretch of water called the Wonsum Channel. And it's here that the new road is being built, and more importantly for us, where the excavations are taking place.
The important thing is this is a precious opportunity to record the archaeology here before it disappears forever as the new road comes through.
The rolling deadlines for completing different sections of the new road mean that the team has had to develop a fast method of systematically recording the objects at the time they're excavated. Every find is individually numbered, plotted by GPS and photographed, as well as being accurately drawn by archaeologists in the field. Back at the construction compound nearby, the data is fed into computers and the photos are carefully traced.
I've come a bit further south on the site now to an area rather poetically known as Zone 6, but there's really interesting archaeology here. 2,000 years ago, this would have been the neck of a peninsula sticking out into the Wonsum Channel. And the archaeologists are finding evidence of the very people who would have been living here when the Romans arrived.
And it's here that the team have discovered the foundations of an Iron Age roundhouse.
And this is a typical building of the period before the Romans arrive in Britain.
Yes, for hundreds of years, thousands of years before the Romans arrived, people lived in circular houses with conical thatched roofs. And sometimes there's been one or two in a small farm, or it seems to be the case here, maybe a small village with 7 or 8 or more houses in it. So very typical of the Iron Age.
So you think this was a village then?
We think so, yes. As you can see, we've got many more of those curvilinear ditches, which we think may indicate where the houses were.
This one's a nice complete circle, but we're just catching the edges here, just little arcs, edges of round houses.
We are really lucky with this one. It doesn't happen very often to have such a good preservation.
So it would have been a timber house. None of the timber is there, but we've still got this ditch that went around the periphery.
Yes.
And is there any dating material that's come out of that ditch?
We are quite lucky in this respect as well. We've had some pottery from the outer ditch, and it suggests it's a Belgic pottery, which would put us about 100 years before the Romans arrived.
So it gives you a really precise date.
A really good dating. Yeah, we're really lucky.
Yeah.
A few feet away, the team have just uncovered a cobbled surface littered with animal bones.
They seem to be kind of embedded in the stones as well.
They believe that this was the butchery and food preparation area for the village, whose very inhabitants would have seen Claudius's army arriving in 43 AD.
We've got these 2 parallel marks, which could be from a knife.
So this is the remains of animals that have been butchered on the spot just here?
It looks like it, yeah.
And here, we've got a tiny gold coin that on this side...
This coin reveals that the inhabitants of the village already had European connections before the Romans invaded.
So on the back, you have the horse, or the charioteer, and on the other side, there's just the very faint remains of the head. And we find coins like this, some just a few miles away at Minster, but in France as well. And we think it may well have been made in France and used in Britain.
That beautiful gold coin from the Iron Age village in Kent suggests we already had links with France at the time of the Roman invasion. But I'm now headed west to Dorset, where there's hard evidence of trading with the Romans themselves well before they thought of making us the latest addition to their empire.
For more than 200 years, the Romans had been expanding their empire across the Mediterranean. But in the 1st century BC, they started setting their sights further afield. Britannia to the northwest might have seemed like the end of the world, but it had things which the Romans wanted. And what the Romans wanted, they usually got.
Britain already had a reputation for its mineral wealth, for its gold, silver and tin, but there was something else the Romans wanted from us, and it was this. Grain. There was plenty of it growing in this part of Dorset back then, just as there is today. And in fact, Britain would go on to become the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. For those living in these agricultural areas, well, some of them would become very rich indeed.
Traditionally, it was thought that the Durotrigas, the Iron Age tribe who occupied this part of Dorset, were warlike and resisted the Roman invaders. But archaeologists from Bournemouth University seem to be finding very different evidence at this late Iron Age farmstead.
Well, this survey of the site, which is a magnetic survey, shows us the Iron Age ditched enclosure we call a banjo enclosure. That's because it superficially resembles a banjo with the body and the neck. And some of these necks are very, very long.
Where are we standing in relation to the structures you can see there?
Well, we're standing right at the entrance here, where presumably there would have been possibly a gate.
So we're looking at this ditch just here?
Yeah, that's right. That's this ditch here, and it follows round and then curving round and back down. This is where you would have entered the site and you would have seen one probably substantial roundhouse and a number of subsidiary roundhouses and a lot of activity going on within this large enclosure. These sites are effectively wealthy, well-appointed, undefended.
But there's something else on the site which is really intriguing the Bournemouth team. They found more than 30 cylindrical pits carved into the chalk bedrock by ancient tools and now excavated by the hands of modern-day archaeology students.
Miles, what are these pits?
Well, these are very sort of large cylindrical storage pits. Basically, it's been cut down straight into the chalk, and we're assuming that what they're actually storing is grain of some kind.
Have you found grain in these pits?
Yes, indeed. We've got small pieces of sort of oats and barley which have come out from the lowest levels of these pits.
Iron Age barley. And presumably that's not just for their consumption on the site here?
This, I would imagine, is stuff that's being exported.
Right.
And to some extent we can see the results of that exportation from the artefacts that are coming up in these pits.
So there's artefacts as well?
Yes, indeed. It appears that once the grains come out, they're putting a whole range of artefacts in. We've got these large slabs of Iron Age pottery.
Oh, yeah. So are they using this as a rubbish pit, then?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're not seeing a random sort of deposit of domestic waste. We seem to be seeing a deliberate selection procedure. We've got fragments of horse and cow and sheep.
It's quite peculiar. It suggests there's something symbolic about placing these objects in there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it might be that having emptied the pit, you've got to put something back in as a kind of offering, perhaps to ensure the, the long-term fertility of the land, perhaps as an offering to the gods.
Pits that the archaeologists are finding all over this site seem to have a very obvious practical use for storage of grain. But there's definitely something else going on. Objects are being placed in the bottom of these pits that have some kind of symbolic value. And it's not just objects, it's not just animal bones and pottery that the archaeologists are finding.
Of all the deposits I've seen on the site, this has to be the strangest.
It's an adult male who's lying face down on, I suppose, what can best be described as a bed of meat.
How strange.
You've got sort of horse and pig and cow bone all there sort of underneath him.
And it looks as though he's just been thrown into the hole. I mean, it really doesn't look as though he's been placed in there with any ceremony. It's not a formal burial, is it?
Certainly to our modern eyes, it looks like he's been rolled in. As I said, he's lying face down. His legs are slightly tangled up. There's no obvious kind of order or perhaps reverence to that. It's difficult to see whether this is a grave in the conventional sense and that the bone represents food for the afterlife, or whether the adult himself represents just part of the deposit.
How strange. There's something very odd going on with these pits, isn't there?
There is. I mean, it's almost like, I suppose, burying an ancestor, burying an aunt or an uncle in a cupboard in the kitchen. It doesn't make sense to us. You know, this is the area where they're living, they're working, but their dead are going in these kind of disused pits.
It's very peculiar. Whatever the meanings of the bones deposited in the pits here in Dorset, it's clear that the people who farmed this land prospered from trading with the Romans. The Bournemouth University dig is showing that far from the popular image of Roman invaders locked in combat with the local tribes, this settlement at least is suggesting a much calmer transition.
Becoming part of the Roman Britain is no significant shock to these people at all. There's just a great deal of continuity. And I think that's pretty much for the whole of Roman Britain, because we get so awed by the high visibility of villas and temples without realising that these just represent less than 1% of what's going on in the countryside. By far and away, the bulk of the population are living the same lifestyle, doing the same things, completely unaffected.
"30 miles north in Somerset, evidence is emerging that here too, local people may have been keeping hold of their ancient beliefs and ways of honouring the gods." There's nothing around to suggest there's anything particularly special or significant about this Somerset field, but I know for certain that 1700 years ago, somebody or a group of people came here and did something right here on this very spot. In late April this year, metal detectorist Dave Crisp was searching this same field. He was about to make the discovery of a lifetime.
I got this funny signal, and it was an iffy signal, it really was. So I dug down, and I dug a bit deeper, and it was still there, and I dug a bit deeper. I'm 12, 14 inches down now, and I put my hand in, and I pulled out a black thing, and I thought, I've got a rock. No, it looks like a bit of pottery. It looks like a Roman bit of burnish, black burnish ware. That's quite interesting, I thought to myself. So I put my hand in again and pulled out a bit more clay, and there was a little radiant, little bronze Roman coin, very, very small, about the size of my fingernail. Then I realised that the piece of burnish ware I had was the top of a pot, and I thought, I got a hoard. And I went, and I'm in the middle of nowhere saying, I've got a hoard. I've been 22 years detecting, and I've never had a hoard before that weekend.
Dave was convinced he'd found treasure, but instead of digging it up, he contacted the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which records archaeological objects found by the public. Finds liaison officer Anna Booth suspected that this was going to be a job for a professional archaeologist.
We actually had no idea how big the hoard was going to be at this stage, so it was very exciting for us all. We uncovered the neck of the vessel, and what we could see was a small dish in the top of it, which was actually acting as a lid. At first, we wondered whether this was the bottom of quite a small vessel and it was turned upside down, but when we dug a bit further, we realised that it was actually a lid sitting in top of an absolutely enormous vessel of the size that none of us had ever seen anything like it before, so it was absolutely fantastic. And it was only at that stage that we realised that it was actually a huge hoard of coins that we were dealing with.
That must have been quite breathtaking.
It was amazing, it was absolutely fantastic. And then over the following 2 days we actually undertook the excavation. And it did take us the full 2 days, starting first thing in the morning till last thing at night, until the sun went down, just excavating thousands upon thousands of coins and bagging them up. It took a huge amount of time, but it was absolutely fascinating and an amazing process to go through.
Because Dave Crisp got archaeologists involved right from the very start, archaeologists who were able to systematically excavate the pot layer by layer, it's meant we have a much better chance of finding out why that pot full of coins was buried in this field all those years ago. The Froome hoard is looking like it might be the biggest coin hoard ever discovered in Britain. They've estimated that there are around 50,000 coins weighing in at 160 kilos. That's about the weight of 2 adults. But the coins need urgent attention, and that's why in early May they were brought here to central London. The Roman coins arrived at the British Museum, still wet and stuck together with heavy Somerset clay. Pippa Pearce is a metals conservator at the museum. For several weeks now, Pippa has been fully occupied, carrying out the first stage of the coins' conservation by carefully washing the contents of the 67 bags which made up the Froome hoard.
So into the fume cupboard for a quick dry.
The coins span 40 years, from AD 253 to 293, and the vast majority are made of debased silver and bronze. Roman coin experts Roger Bland and Sam Moorhead have dropped everything to concentrate on the Somerset coins.
Yet another coin of Tetricus.
That's Claudius. That's the emperor standing holding a branch.
They've been sorting the coins by emperor at a rate of nearly 6,000 a week. It's now 8 weeks since the Froome hoard was raised and all the coins have been cleaned and sorted. But are we any closer to finding out how and why such an enormous hoard was buried in that Somerset field? Roger, this is just a small fraction of the whole hoard. How many coins do you think there are?
Well, we think the final number is going to be just over 52,500 coins.
So how big is this hoard in the context of other hoards that have been found in Britain?
It's the largest ever hoard found in a single pot in this country. There was another hoard found in 1978, which had just a couple of thousand more coins, but that was in 2 pots.
And do you have any idea of the value of these coins?
Maybe about the equivalent of 4 years' pay for a Roman legionary soldier. So if you were to turn that into present-day values, that might be about £100,000 in present-day terms.
So, Sam, this is a piece of the pot, is it?
Yes, this is the piece of the pot that was found in. And when they excavated, the pot was already broken. And you can see it's quite thin. Neither I nor the conservator believe that this would have been able to hold 160 kilograms of metal without breaking.
Yeah, that is very thin.
And so it's almost certain that the pot was actually buried in the ground first, and then the coins were added after it had been put in the ground.
Sam doesn't think that this pot was one person's saving scheme, but more likely part of an ancient ritual.
I don't believe myself that this is a hoard of coins intended for recovery. And I think what you could see is a community of people who are actually making offerings, and they are each pouring in their own contribution to a communal ritual votive offering to the gods or whoever it is.
Just because it's communal, that doesn't necessarily mean it's ritual, though, does it? Because people could be burying something in the ground that they were worried was going to be taken away from them.
If you're going to bury this for security and safety, you put in lots of different pots, so you could easily take them out of the ground later. Also, if you wanted to get these coins out of the ground, you'd have to dig down to the pot, smash the pot, and then shovel them out, which would also be a very lengthy process. So I believe that it was never intended for recovery.
And you're seeing echoes here of a more ancient tradition, pre-Roman?
I think so, yes, absolutely. The same people. We know from other studies that the people of the West Country were the same people as they were in the Bronze and the Iron Ages, so why not continue the same practices?
I am naturally quite a sceptical person, and I tend to look for the most obvious explanation for things. But it really does seem, from talking to the experts, that whoever it was that buried that pot full of coins in the ground wasn't intending to come back to it. In which case, perhaps this is an echo of an ancient tradition that we're seeing. Maybe those coins are a votive offering, and perhaps this was a sacred field. Not all archaeological recoveries happen as fast as the Roman coin hoard. There's one project involving a catastrophic fire and a Roman shipwreck, which has lasted for over 30 years. St Peter Port, Guernsey, in the Channel Islands. Jason Monaghan is museums director here. As a young student in the 1980s, along with diver Richard Keane, he was involved in the biggest archaeology project the island had ever seen.
In the course of my diving in the harbour and the pierheads, picking up pottery and scallops and whatever else I could find, I came across a wooden wreck.
Richard thought it was an old barge used to build the harbour wall, but it would be another year before he realised the significance of what he had found.
There was the wreck, more exposed, and great big chunks of Roman tile. You know, you can't mistake Roman tile. I thought, oh, crumbs. This is going to be really interesting.
Richard had found the remains of a Roman ship, uniquely preserved on the seabed for over 1,600 years. But how did it come to be here?
St Peter Port would have had a wide sandy harbour, and this ship would have been somewhere in the entrance, possibly anchored, possibly moored. It caught fire for whatever reason, we don't know. The fire raged for some time, then the water came on board, quenched the fire, and the ship sank.
What the maritime archaeologists had found were the remains of a Gallo-Roman trading vessel which transported cargoes from as far south as Spain, through the English Channel, and possibly even up into the North Sea. The ship was carrying blocks of pitch, a natural resin, which would accidentally preserve the wreck.
We believe the fire raged in the back of the ship. The back of the ship is the best preserved because the cargo of pitch the ship was carrying melted during the fire. And this spread out to cover an area of about 8 square metres. So when the ship sank, this quenched into a solid mass and effectively held the back end of the ship down.
The Roman timbers have now crossed the Channel to Portsmouth and the Mary Rose Trust, where for the past decade they've been treated and dried.
More exposed, presumably.
Yeah, that was sticking out the seabed at this end here. Yeah.
For Jason too, it's been a long journey.
This was my first job after leaving university, so it's actually very strange after 2.5 decades to be coming back and seeing the timbers in the final state that we talked about so very excitedly all those years ago.
The conservation process has worked beautifully there.
But there's one final problem to overcome. The timbers are wrapped, boxed and ready to go home, but there's nowhere big enough on Guernsey at present to house the reconstructed ship.
This is a very important ship for Guernsey.
Roman archaeologists talk a lot about trade in inverted commas, but actually we have very little evidence apart from inferring that this pottery went from here to there. So here we have a very solid example of how the trade was carried out. Ships like ours sailed from port to port, carrying stuff in their holds.
30 years might seem like a long time for an archaeological project. But back here at Vindolanda, they've been digging for even longer. And during that time, it's here where we've come closest to knowing the Romans who occupied Britain.
You're right.
It is tempting to think that we know everything about the Romans already. After all, they wrote things down, they left us records. But archaeology gives us a different perspective. It helps to fill in details and paint a fuller picture, but it can also challenge our preconceptions, and that's when sites like this get really interesting. So Andrew, what have we got here?
Well, what we've got here is the wonderful...
Until recently, it was believed that temples were never sited inside Roman auxiliary forts. That was until last year.
So this is all part of the temple?
This is all part of the temple. It actually stretches from the gate all the way up to the angle tower. This is all 3 rooms of the quite an impressive building. And what's awesome about this is that we absolutely do not expect to find temples to pagan gods, particularly Eastern cults, inside auxiliary forts. This is the first one that's ever been found anywhere in the Roman Empire.
Really?
We were actually looking for a toilet block under here because we've got barracks behind us. And
so you're looking for latrines and you found a temple?
Looking for a loo, we found a temple. There is some sort of poetry in that, I'm sure.
So these little pillars here, are they supporting a floor? Is this a hypercourse system?
That's right, exactly right, a hypercourse system.
The floor.
You can still see the burning on some of the stones here to show that they had to fire it up in the wintertime at least.
So where would the fire itself have been then?
The little furnace is in this room behind.
And then the hot air comes through there?
Comes through the flue.
And then circulates around here.
And they even know the identity of the god who is being worshipped in this newly discovered temple. Because amongst the ruins, they uncovered this remarkable find, an altar to a god from Turkey called Jupiter Dolicanus.
Here you've got the beautiful iconography of Jupiter Dolicanus riding his bull on this side. He's got his thunderbolts clutched in his hand
and
here.
An axe.
And the axe in the other hand.
So is this altar set up by a military man?
This altar is set up by the big chief himself, the commanding officer of the fort. And if we just read the front of it here, we can see IOM for Jupiter Optimus Maximus.
Jupiter, the biggest and the best.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got to be a little bit beneath Jupiter. And then underneath him, you've got the actual name of the god himself. It's Dolokino, D-O-L-O-C-H-E-N-O. And very, very clear on that line there. And then underneath that, you've got the dedicator, Sulpicius Pudens, his second name. And the very, very bottom line, very common on most inscriptions, VSLM. And that really just means the guy willingly and deservedly fulfilled his vow. And what you're looking at here is the end of a contract. It's a personal contract between Sulpicius Pudens and the god Jupiter Dolicanus.
So he's promised to erect an altar to this god somewhere, and he's now fulfilled his promise.
Exactly.
The sides are so beautifully preserved with the relief carving and the writing, but obviously the top's been exposed. This is all very weathered, isn't it?
It's really well worn, but also it's been very, very badly damaged as well by people coming in when they were demolishing the temple. And the demolition of the temple happened sometime, we think, in the 350s or 70s. And you've got this sort of power struggle with Christianity becoming the official religion. A lot of ancient pagan cults and shrines end up going by the wayside. Poor old Jupiter Dolicanus here eventually fell victim to such a new movement on the northern frontier of Roman Britain.
Christianity had arrived at Vindolanda, but just 50 years later, in 410 AD, the Roman army departed Britain, this time for good. Vindolanda too would slowly be abandoned and would fall into ruin. It's the remoteness of this part of Northumberland which has allowed Vindolanda and its archaeology to survive as a legacy to the Roman occupation of Britain.
In the 400 years the Romans were here, they transformed our country from its language to its landscape, leaving a lasting legacy that remains with us today. And yet, 1600 years later, we're still discovering new things about their society. From that terrible infanticide on the banks of the Thames to that massive coin hoard found just earlier this year in the southwest. There's so much more to understand about the Romans in Britain, and so the digging continues.
We might be a small island, but we've got a big history. Everywhere you stand, there are worlds beneath your feet. And so every year, hundreds of archaeologists across Britain go looking for more clues.
who lived here, when and how.
You can even see the architecture of the bone inside the jaw there.
Yes.
Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, temples to treasure.
And it's still sharp.
From Orkney to Devon, we're joining this year's quest on sea, land and air. We'll share all of the questions and find some of the answers as we join the teams in the field, digging for Britain. The further back in time we go, the more rare those glimpses of our ancestors become. Tonight, we're going into deep prehistory, and this is where archaeology really comes into its own. With no written records, those pieces of evidence that we pull out of the ground are the only clues we have to the mysterious world of prehistoric Britain. I'm on a journey through a million years of history that will take me from Orkney to the south coast. I'll be discovering art made by Ice Age Britons.
Is this a leg down here? Is it coming down to a leg?
Yeah, that's right. The leg's here.
And seeing how farming first developed here.
See some more teeth sticking up here.
Yeah.
I'll be finding out how the sea holds clues to the birth of trade. And as we travel through time, we'll see how a culture emerged that still resonates today.
So when was she found?
Our journey begins before Britain was even an island, when a broad river flowed through East Anglia. And this is where archaeologists are trying to find out when the first people arrived in Britain.
For over 200 years, archaeologists have searched these lands for signs that early human species may once have lived here. But the first humans to have emerged from Africa were tropical. They just weren't adapted to cold climates, and they could not have survived in Northern Europe.
Now, on this beach in Norfolk, archaeologists are finding remarkable evidence that may challenge this belief.
I've been following this project for years, and the archaeologists are about 3 weeks into this year's dig, so I've been really excited about coming here to find out how they've been getting on.
The team are part of an internationally renowned project searching for clues that will help them date this site.
So Nick, you're a few weeks in.
Nick Ashton of the British Museum is leading the excavation.
And what sort of evidence are you finding in these ancient river sediments?
We're getting pollen from these fine-grained sediments, we're getting wood, we're getting other plant remains, little seeds. Also getting beetles, and they're very good for reconstructing climate. And on top of that, we're getting animal remains, animal bones and teeth, and they really help with the dating of the site.
To retrieve that evidence, every bucket load excavated must be painstakingly examined.
So it's all happening down here. What have you got for us, Sophie? Nothing at the moment.
Not much. It wasn't there. Oh, wow. Some pebbles.
Some pebbles at the moment, so each sieve load is checked and sorted, and there doesn't appear to be anything in that.
Over a 5-year period, they've sifted through 70 tonnes of sediment. But sometimes it's the most unlikely finds that provide vital clues.
Oh no, pine cones.
Ah, oh right. And there, it's quite a weathered but surviving pine cone.
Really?
Part of one, yeah. You could look at the structure of that and confirm the exact species.
When you're looking this far back in time, even a single find like this pine cone core is crucial. Find by find, the archaeologists can reconstruct this mysterious lost world. A pine forest that was inhabited by creatures no longer seen in Britain. Simon Parfitt from the Natural History Museum is an expert on prehistoric mammals.
And what's that in that box down there?
Okay, this thing is
it looks like a
incredible.
stone.
It looks like a stone. Believe it or not, it's a hyena dropping. This is fossilised hyena poo.
So So we know there were hyena here as
There
well.
are hyenas, so you've got large carnivores. We've got this fantastic rodent, jaw, with some of the teeth. And this is an extinct beaver-like rodent, and it was semi-aquatic, living along the banks of the river.
It's such a beautifully preserved fossil. I mean, you can even see the architecture of the bone inside the jaw there.
Yes, yeah, it's a wonderful thing.
It's because we know when each of these species became extinct that these fossils are helping us to date the site.
This is a tooth of a mammoth, and this is in fact one of the earliest forms of mammoth that we find in this part of the world. This helps us with the date because this is quite primitive. So we have a fantastic record.
You can tell that from the teeth.
That's right, yeah. It has very distinctive teeth. You can see this is the chewing surface, and you have a series of plates, and they're very widely spaced. And this is a feature of primitive mammoths. Later mammoths, the plates tend to get closer together, the enamel gets thinner. So that's one of the features we can use to identify it.
This tooth belonged to a type of mammoth that died out over 700,000 years ago. So its position in these sediments gives another vital clue to the archaeologists.
With the various types of dating, we're able to say that the site dates somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million years old.
So that's the date of those sediments that we're looking at in the trench, between 800,000 and 1 million years old.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. This project really is unique. So many important discoveries are made by pure chance, especially in prehistory, where something might be found in a quarry or when a road is being built. But here the archaeologists have set out to find something new, to make an important discovery. And they've done it.
Because what's being found here are not just animal and plant finds. It's not just evidence of a vanished landscape from perhaps 1 million years ago. There are finds suggesting humans could have lived here then too.
Actually, today we recovered one of the rare artefacts that we're also getting from the site, and this is really exciting because it shows that humans were living here at that time.
This has just come out today?
This is a small flake, it's slightly broken, but you can see all the telltale signs of human manufacture.
This tiny object is a waste flake left over from making flint tools.
So this is evidence of humans in Britain going back possibly 1 million years.
Yeah, and so it makes it by a long way the oldest site in Northern Europe, the oldest human site in Northern Europe.
So I'm holding in my hands a piece of evidence of the earliest humans to inhabit this island going back nearly 1 million years.
They found over 70 pieces of flint, which show signs of human working. And amongst them are even some intact stone tools.
This, we actually nicknamed this the butter knife because it's so pretty. But you can see all the evidence of human working there, that bulb with percussion rings coming out from that characteristic rippling. And actually on this piece, they've modified that edge. It would certainly be ideal as some sort of, for cutting meat.
Yeah.
So this is the original sort of knife and fork of the old Stone Age.
And it's still sharp.
And after 800,000 million years.
No human remains have yet been found to confirm who made these tools. But it was a truly ancient species, some 750,000 years older than even the Neanderthals.
So Haysborough has pushed back the earliest human occupation of Britain by at least 200,000 years. But what's really remarkable is that the humans living here back then were surviving in extremely harsh conditions.
At this time, Britain was approaching an ice age. How did these early species manage to survive here? Were they more advanced than we've previously thought? These are the questions now facing experts like Chris Stringer from the Natural History Museum.
So what were those capabilities? Did these people have control of fire? Did they have clothes?
Whether they had clothing, whether they had the use of fire, we can't tell from here.
They must have had ways of keeping warm.
Well, that's right, yes. I mean, the environment was comparable to, say, southern Scandinavia at the present day. And yes, I think, you know, stick us in the winters in southern Scandinavia today and we would have problems coping. So we'd have to imagine, probably, that there was at least basic clothing and probably the use of fire. But the evidence has yet to be found.
It does make us look again at these earlier human species, and perhaps they were more sophisticated than we've given them credit for.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Their capabilities were far greater, and that's really exciting. So we have to make them, in some ways, certainly more like us than we would have believed.
We know there were people here in Britain nearly 1 million years ago. They were surviving in incredibly cold conditions. It gives us newfound respect, I think, for those earlier human species. And at the end of the day, it's those insignificant finds that archaeological revolutions are made of.
We don't know how long those people survived here, but they were eventually wiped out by the vicious climate. For hundreds of thousands of years, Britain went through some of the most violent climate changes in world history, which repeatedly forced people out. So these were not our ancestors. To find them, we have to go forward hundreds of thousands of years to the end of the last ice age, and to a site in modern-day Nottinghamshire where they once lived.
It wasn't until around 13,000 years ago that Britain became recolonised by modern humans, Homo sapiens, people like us. And this time, they were here to stay. And they were living in caves like these at Creswell Crags at the end of the last ice age. We know that these people were physically identical to us, but archaeologists are relentless in their search to find out just how similar they were to us in other ways, searching for those elusive things which let us feel truly connected to them.
Cave art can speak to us like nothing else, a distant echo from an ancient world with no written language. And since the discovery of the famous Lascaux rock art in France in the 1940s, the hunt has been on to find similar rock art in Britain.
Archaeologists scoured the walls of caves like these, but found nothing. And they put that down to Britain being such a challenging environment back then, that people were just surviving, clinging on to existence with their fingernails. They didn't have time for frivolities like rock art.
That belief was turned on its head by discoveries made in this cave, where I met Ian Wall. He's an archaeologist and director of Creswell Crags.
Thank you.
So you're now standing at the level that we think our prehistoric ancestors were sort of 12, 13,000 years ago. So it's the best place to actually view the rock art that they were creating.
So I can see a few scratches on the walls here.
Yes. Would you like to come and stand here and I'll show you. This is one of the first figures that was discovered in 2003. But you can just pick out some fainter engraved lines here.
At first, I struggled to see what Ian was seeing. Gradually, an image emerged.
This is the top of a neck of an animal.
Yep, all right, you're convincing me.
And the ear.
And coming down here,
that's right.
A mouth.
That's right, yes, yes, and that's the chin running underneath, yes.
Is this a leg down here? Is it coming down to a leg?
Yeah, that's right. The leg's here, and then the underbelly of the animal.
That's remarkable.
There it was, appearing right before my eyes, the image of a deer. We can imagine perhaps how important this creature would have been to our ancestors. It was almost certainly one of the things that kept them alive.
So how
How do you know that that is Ice Age?
Crucially, you get these deposits of flowstone. It's redeposited calcite, and that forms a thin skin of deposit, and sometimes that lies over the top of these engraved lines.
That's this white area
That's
here.
right, yes. And that can be dated fairly precisely with a technique called uranium series dating.
Right, so if you can date that flowstone, then if the engravings are underneath it, they must predate it.
That's right, yes.
So how old is that flowstone?
So it's roughly around 13,000 years old.
So we really are looking at Ice Age art?
Yes, that's the clincher.
This is the oldest rock art to be found anywhere on these islands.
So much of archaeology is about how people live their lives in quite a mundane way, the tools they made, the diet they were eating, that sort of thing. But here we've got art, which is something a little bit different, and it does give you a real connection back to those people. It's incredibly evocative. You can imagine them in that cave making those images on the wall, and I rather like the mystery that we will never know what it really means.
I'm on my way to a dig in Orkney, where archaeologists are finding out more about early farmers and their mysterious beliefs. My destination is the tiny island of Westray, home to a site called the Links of Noltland, where one of this year's most exciting digs is happening.
Wow, what a way to see an archaeological site, this bird's eye view looking straight down on it. Looks great, can't wait to get down there. Many Neolithic sites are monumental and ceremonial. They're really impressive, but it's like going to a cathedral to find out how everyday people live today.
This site is different. I've come here because archaeologists are unearthing vital evidence of early farms. And these are the extraordinary and rare remains of a 5,000-year-old village where the farmers once lived. Archaeologists here are uncovering a remarkable story of a struggle to survive. Then as now, these islands must have felt like the edge of the world. I was given a tour around the site by Richard Strachan.
It's almost always windy in Orkney. The weather can be on your side sometimes. A little bit of rain on a site's very good as well. Archaeologically, it keeps the soil nice and moist, so it is challenging.
Yeah, it is like you have 4 seasons in one day. I can't believe it was raining this morning and now we've got sunshine.
It's very normal here.
Should we go over and have a look at what some of the archaeologists are finding?
The buildings are covered with a layer of ancient rubbish or midden, and it's from this that many of the signs of everyday prehistoric life are appearing.
So the whole site is basically sealed by this midden material, and this is containing the shell, the bone, all that sort of stuff. And you can see that we're getting pottery too within this. We're getting flint.
Is that a piece of pottery down there?
Yeah, this is a fantastic piece of pottery that Sean's just uncovered. You can see the wonderful decoration on it.
Because this archaeology is only centimetres below the surface, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can see, literally, you're looking at in places it's very, very shallow.
Under the sand is the evidence the archaeologists have been hoping for. Proof that people here were growing barley, which was one of the earliest plants to be domesticated. Hazel Moore is directing excavations here.
I want to go and talk to Hazel about something rather interesting over this side of the site. What's the evidence for the barley farming?
Carbonised cereal grain coming from these midden deposits. They had field systems which run from the settlement down the slope, and they were middening and enriching the soils there, so presumably that was for growing their crops all around the settlement.
From the field system, evidence of composting is emerging. Each layer of soil tells a story of a struggle to make farming work here.
when we actually look at the profiles, the soil profiles that, from the earliest times, what we have are cultivated soils swamped again and again by blowing sand.
So do you think this would have been a challenging environment to be farming in?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's challenging nowadays, and it wouldn't have been any different then. It's light sandy soils are ideal for cultivation in that they can be worked easily and turned easily, but they're also very prone to erosion, and it's a very windy place.
The conditions here would have made it difficult to survive just growing crops. But new finds are showing that domesticated animals were extremely important to these early farmers. But yet again, amongst the seemingly mundane finds, there are marvellous glimpses of a vanished world. Emerging from the soils is something which has stunned the archaeologists. The skulls of 40 cattle built into the foundations of a wall.
How strange. Can we get a bit closer to it down there?
Yeah, you can come in and have a look down here.
This is really peculiar.
I can see a whole line of them here. This is the outer face of the wall along here, the stones, and that's the inner face there. So they're placed into the core of the wall, into the thickness of the wall.
How peculiar, because that means that they wouldn't have been visible when the building was standing.
No, they would have been placed there when the wall was being built. They would, the foundation level of the building. And you can see, I mean, how they sort of relate to each other. They've been put in sequentially, these ones, and the horns are actually overlapping on those ones, and then they've put some stones in and then some more cattle skulls all along.
It's making them part of a building. It's almost monumentalising them, isn't it?
It
it's
is,
somehow enshrining them.
Imbuing the building with their spirit or whatever, yeah. Building them into the very foundations.
This strange discovery reinforces what the researchers have learned about the importance of livestock to those early farmers. It's easy to see why cattle were so important in this fragile and remote landscape. And it's yet another glimpse into a mysterious ancient mindset.
This is just utterly bizarre, these cattle skulls built into the fabric of a building. We'll never know exactly what they mean, but they obviously represent some complex beliefs.
The archaeologists now know that this land was farmed for around 50 generations, but eventually the struggle proved too great. Overcome by the wind and sand, they gave up and abandoned their village. It appears that the buildings were deliberately filled in with rubble, within which archaeologists found what could be a defining symbol of the farmers' defeat.
Now, of course, this is something we found last year, which really is quite unique, and we hadn't seen anything like this from the whole of Scotland before.
You brought her to show me how lovely.
And there she is in all her glory. I think you can take her.
Very small.
Yeah.
This tiny figurine is known as the Westray Wifey, and despite her homespun appearance, she may be the earliest known expression of religious identity ever found in Scotland.
She's really sweet. She's got a very cartoon-like face, hasn't she?
She has. We can just pick out that she has eyes and a very sort of curvy eyebrow.
Yeah.
And she's got this sort of a very rough mouth, but she also got arms down by her sides. In her design.
Yeah. And there's scratches on the top of her head as well.
Yeah, like her hair almost.
Yeah.
Where the figurine was found makes her even more intriguing. She seems to have been carefully positioned in the abandoned ruins.
It seems like she was probably put there deliberately as a closing deposit. She was placed there.
Yeah.
And then there's no evidence that anybody ever came and did anything here again. So that was probably their way of marking the close of that settlement.
She's really sweet.
Hazel believes the wifey's placing may have been a ritual end to the farmers' long struggle.
We're actually seeing how people thought, that they decided that this was a good way to close this building off at the end of the period. So it gives you much more of an insight into how people's minds worked at the time.
If the researchers are right, then the Westray wifey is unique. A 5,000-year-old household goddess, perhaps.
Figurines of this type are usually thought to be goddesses or, you know, some religious deity kind of thing. Given that she's the only one that we have and we don't have widespread representations, it's hard to argue that she is definitely a goddess. It seemed that she must be representational of some concept, religious concept.
It's rather wonderful to hold this tiny little figurine. It's rather hard to know what she meant for the people that made her, but nonetheless, she's a fantastic little message from the past and utterly unique.
But just days after I left the dig, a second figurine was unearthed, bolstering Hazel's belief that these may have been household goddesses. This is just the third season of digging here. Every day, more of the mysterious settlement is revealed. For thousands of years, people had buried their dead in communal graves. Then around 4,500 years ago, something changed in that time-honoured ritual, and people began to be buried in individual graves, something which seems much more familiar to us today. This is Culdathal Man. He was discovered in 1975, and he had been buried in the new way.
This is very well preserved, considering this is a 4,000-year-old skeleton.
His skeleton is curated by Alison Sheridan. In his grave, archaeologists found a beaker, a distinctive clay pot that was the symbol of this new burial style. We know that beaker burials started on the continent, but once they arrived here, they spread rapidly throughout the country. And the question that has perplexed archaeologists for 150 years is how that beaker culture spread so far, so quickly. Now a team of archaeologists is using cutting-edge science to work that out. They want to know if it was just the ideas that travelled, or if the people did too. Janet Montgomery and Jane Evans are analysing the isotopic signatures of beaker skeletons like Culdathal Man to find out where they lived and whether they moved during their lifetimes. To do that, they must painstakingly extract some tooth enamel from each Bronze Age individual.
Well, we only need a very small amount, less than a match head size of tissue, but you have to make sure when you take it that it's not contaminated. It has to be cleaned, it has to be carefully removed so you don't mix up the tissues, and that it's free from any contamination from the burial. What we want to do is take something that tells you about the person when they were alive, not what's happened during the time their body's been buried in the ground.
Chemicals in each sample tell us where that person grew up. We know where they were then buried, so we can tell if someone moved during their lifetime or if they stayed in their childhood home. Janet and Jane have analysed over 250 beaker skeletons in this way. The project has been 5 years in the making. It's the biggest ever survey of our prehistoric ancestors. And Culdathal Man is the latest to join it. His teeth were in such poor condition that Jane had to use a different technique to extract the sample.
These teeth have got almost no enamel remaining on them. So what I did, instead of slicing the tooth up, I had to pick off very carefully with forceps small fragments of the enamel.
Jane managed to obtain a sample, but once she got the results, she was convinced there had been a mistake.
It was only after I got the enamel results in triplicate that I was convinced and happy enough with the result to tell everybody else what we'd got.
The analysis has been carried out here at the British Geological Survey, and after 5 years, the researchers are just beginning to bring all their results together and draw some conclusions. I wonder how our man from Culdathal has done.
The isotope composition that his teeth gave suggested that he came from an area of this type of rock. this area of Antrim, and it's the Antrim basalts.
Do you think he's Irish?
That is the most likely place for him to have come from.
How interesting.
Yeah. And so he managed to make it from his childhood site here to his burial site up and around here.
So around 4,000 years ago, Calderthal man moved 300 miles across the seas from his Irish home to his Scottish grave, where he lay buried in a signature beaker burial. But Calderthal man is just one of the 250 skeletons from around the country which could explain how the beaker culture spread.
Yeah. What about the isotope project as a whole? What is it telling you about this period in the Bronze Age and about populations moving around?
A lot of the evidence that I've got from this project and other data, they seem to be very mobile at this time.
The survey reveals some intriguing results, showing our ancestors travelling long distances across the country. Results from beaker burials in the Yorkshire Wolds area, for example, showed that over 50% of the individuals sampled had moved there from somewhere else. Some from as far afield as Scotland.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think you tend to think that people in these prehistoric societies were perhaps a lot more settled than that.
The further back you go, the more settled they were.
Yeah,
It doesn't work that way.
No.
This project is really interesting because of the scale of it. They've looked at 250 individuals, and that means we can start to answer some of those big questions about the population of Britain during the Bronze Age. I'm on my way to meet a group of amateur archaeologists who are uncovering a remarkable story about Bronze Age Britain.
4,000 years ago, these waters would have been buzzing with ships. Bronze Age Britons were travelling and trading the length of this coast. I'm heading towards a site that has yielded a treasure trove of beautiful objects and vivid proof of the early importance of trade and the risks that traders ran. We're about half a mile off the coast near Salcombe in South Devon.
We're approaching really carefully because there are divers down there at the moment. Hello.
Hi. Hello, Alice. Hello.
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 These aren't professional archaeologists, they're divers who found a love for history, and for me that makes what they're finding here all the more special.
It's real dedication here. These guys are down at Salcombe every few weeks, diving in the same spot, constantly looking for new objects that are coming up from the seabed.
The team dive using underwater metal detectors to scan the seabed. In the last few months, their dedication has paid off with a massive haul of objects, which have been sent to the British Museum, where they're being analysed by curator Ben Roberts.
In total, we've got over 300 objects. We're still working through them at the moment, and they're still being found. That's the fantastic thing. What's amazing about this particular collection of objects, it encapsulates where we were culturally about 3,000 or so years ago. You have swords, and this was, for your Bronze Age warrior, what you would have used in conflict against your neighbours. And we have plenty of evidence for warfare at this time. Also, you have large-scale trade. This is proper large-scale trade in commodities.
So that's the next couple of divers going down.
The divers can spend up to an hour at a time underwater at a depth of 10 metres.
I was talking to Jim and he said that the seabed, the sediments, the gravels move around quite a bit down there. So every time they dive, there might be something new exposed.
The group dive around once a month. Because the seabed is constantly moving, it's impossible to predict whether they'll find anything. Perhaps the most eye-catching of the finds so far examined at the British Museum is the exquisite jewellery.
Usually when we find Bronze Age gold from this time, from about just over 3,000 years ago, we find relatively simple gold objects. So for instance here, you have a fragment of what would have been a twisted gold neck ring, where you take your gold bar and you twist it. Similarly, you have gold bracelets. These are solid bar bracelets. They've just taken a bar of gold and they've just twisted it around the wrist. What this means is that these bracelets here are just far in excess of anything that had come before. Here you have 8 strands of gold wire that have been twisted on their own and then bound together to create this stunning little bracelet, which, when it came off the seabed, was just perfectly coiled. These represent the absolute pinnacle of Bronze Age gold working.
So what we've got here is this small group of divers who are spending all their free time combing the seabed down here in South Devon. And they're making really significant discoveries that are helping us to understand the Bronze Age that little bit better.
Both the divers and Ben have reached the same conclusion about why these objects are here.
Although we're still finding objects and the stories are still being written, I think this is probably a shipwreck. And I say that because we're finding things that we don't normally find on land, and we don't normally find when they've been deliberately placed in rivers and deliberately placed in bogs, as we have all over Britain.
The group have discovered one of the oldest shipwrecks in Britain. No remains of the ship itself have been found, but most of the objects were probably its cargo. But there's a mystery here too. The majority of the objects date to around 2300 BC, but some date to a few centuries later. Ben has been trying to work out why this could be.
I think there's only 2 ways that you can really explain why these objects ended up off the south coast of Devon in the same place. And one is a shipwreck, or maybe 2 shipwrecks, and the other one is to say, well, they were deliberately placed there. So we have this tradition in the Bronze Age of placing bronze and gold objects in special points in the landscape, such as hillsides or in bogs and springs. So it's possible that it was a combination of the 2, with one taking place slightly earlier as a shipwreck and one potentially later as a dedication. It's really hard to say.
So the objects with the later dates may have been an offering thrown into the sea in remembrance of that original shipwreck. It's a touching thought. Although the gold objects found by the divers are the most beautiful and striking, they are not the most important of the finds. Instead, it's some much more mundane lumps of tin.
These ingots that we have, absolutely the first tin ingots we've ever been found in the Bronze Age in Northern Europe. Very exciting for me, I understand, not necessarily aesthetically beautiful for everyone else, but nonetheless very exciting. The tin ingots represents this missing link in our Bronze Age world between the finished bronze objects that we have here, the bronze ingots. So it's these that represent our first evidence of the tin trade in this part of the world. So it's these, for an archaeologist, that are actually more exciting than the gold.
Archaeologists have long suspected that the southwest, with its naturally occurring tin ore, would have played a central role in supplying this raw material across Europe. This is the crucial evidence they've been waiting for, found by our amateur team.
Those bubbles coming up there mean there's a couple of divers just about to break the surface, which is very exciting. I wonder what they found. Hello, Mick.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Oh. Welcome.
Did you find anything?
An old bullet.
All right. No, it's not Bronze Age, is it, Mick?
No.
It's very disappointing. they didn't find anything today, but undoubtedly there's more of this Bronze Age shipwreck to come to light here. And of course what we're looking at is a 3,000-year-old tragedy. Imagine this boat laden with tin and copper ingots making its way along the coast here, and perhaps they were just in sight of a safe harbour when disaster struck. We'll never know whether the crew managed to survive, but their precious cargo of copper and tin was claimed by the sea.
We started our million-year journey with finds of rudimentary flint tools made by ancient hominins. As we've travelled forward through time to discover this complex trading society, everything has become more familiar. What strikes me is that in our prehistory are quite clearly the roots of what we think of today as our culture, our way of life. And what really brought that home were some discoveries made in the grave of a chieftain in Fort Eviat in Scotland last year.
When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he reportedly said, "I see things, wonderful things." This is what really happens when archaeologists make those amazing discoveries.
Oh my God!
Oh my God!
This is the dramatic moment last year when archaeologists filmed themselves as they lifted the capstone of a 4,000-year-old tomb. It would change our understanding of how Bronze Age people buried their loved ones. After discovering the tomb with geophysics, archaeologist Kenny Brophy and his team had to wait a year to be able to open it.
Oh my God!
That's some metal.
This is cool as We might have to bleep that out.
Yes, there's a lot of excitement on site.
This is an incredibly exciting moment in archaeology, isn't it? Because a lot of archaeological excavation is about painstakingly removing thin layers of soil, very gradually uncovering things.
Yes.
This is a rather momentous uncovering of a grave. It must be quite exciting to be standing there at the time.
It was. I mean, it was really a set-piece moment. There was a real sense that we just didn't know what we were going to find, which is one of the great excitements of archaeology, of course, but this really was a mystery.
Oh, for Christ's sake, what happened?
The stone-lined grave known as a kist held many treasures, and it would prove to be the grave of a Bronze Age chieftain. But there was one big surprise. No sign of his body remained.
This is really peculiar, isn't it? You've taken this stone off the top of the kist burial and you're confronted with objects which are, fantastic. You've got organic remains, but there's no skeleton.
Well, that was the thing that immediately struck us, because I imagined in my mind's eye that when the kist was opened, we would see a skeleton lying there, maybe with a nice piece of pottery next to it, and nothing I saw conformed to anything that I expected.
But the team did recover this mysterious white material.
One thing we did notice when we were digging, though, that there was a kind of a white powder stuck to the side of the kist.
It was this powder that would solve the mystery of the missing skeleton.
We found out there was some kind of calcite substance which would suggest it came from bone, and that bone was perhaps broken down by body fluids that were leaking from the body, and then the bones all dissolved.
Right, so this is bone mineral, but bone mineral that's been dissolved and then redeposited inside that grave.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
And this is all that's left?
Yeah, this is all that's left. So essentially, that bag of material there is probably the only remnants that are left of the person who was buried in this kist, which is, I suppose, a sad end, really, to this person.
From almost the first moment, the team suspected they had a high-status burial, and one key find confirmed that. This magnificent dagger.
This is very elaborate, isn't it?
It's a fantastic piece of Bronze Age technology involving a large blade of bronze, which is a copper and tin alloy, rivets holding it together, a bone handle, a band of gold which is holding it all together. There's wooden pins involved here as well. So this is an object that's not just about the metal of the dagger, it's about so much more than that.
This is a really beautiful, elaborate object.
The sheer rarity of these in the archaeological record suggests that what we're dealing with here is someone who was very important, and someone who, this dagger perhaps was a symbol of their power and symbol of their importance. So it was entirely appropriate that when they died, that ended up in the grave with them.
After the initial discovery, it's back here at the lab that most of the work has been done to identify the objects found in the grave.
We found a group of objects that were perhaps in a leather bag, and these include these strange-looking objects here, a lump of a metallic substance which is an iron ore called limonite, a yellow iron ore, and then it's lying on top of this stone tool which is made of flint.
These objects served a very particular purpose in the Bronze Age.
And the combination of these two suggests that this is probably some kind of fire-making kit, a striker light that maybe was something portable that could be carried about.
And Kenny, do you think a fire-making kit like this would have been something that everybody would have been carrying around, or just particular special people?
The balance of probability is that these were objects associated with powerful people. Perhaps making fire was something that powerful people were associated with. But we can't rule out the fact that these may be everyday objects that everyone had because everyone needed fire.
We know exactly what it was used for, but we're not sure whether that use was a special, magical use, or perhaps whether it's something as ordinary as a box of matches. All we know is that the people burying this person thought he should have it with him in the grave.
Yes, yeah.
But for me, the most exciting finds from this grave are also the smallest ones.
And there they are. In amongst those objects in the grave, archaeologists also found these tiny things. They're flower heads. Now, archaeologists often find pollen in graves, but pollen could get there because it's blown in, or perhaps arrives in the grave in food and drink that have been placed in there with the body. But here what we have is actual flower heads of meadowsweet. So we know for the first time that Bronze Age people placed flowers in the graves of their dead, that flowers were part of the Bronze Age funeral ritual, just as they are today. This is a piece of meadowsweet just waiting to flower in the summer. So we know that whoever it was that was interred in that grave at Forteviot, he was buried there during the summer months. And I just find it amazing that something so ephemeral, those flower heads, have survived through thousands of years. And whilst the physical remains, the bones of that person, have long since disappeared, what we have got is the evidence of this incredibly tender act of placing flowers in somebody's grave. It's something that gives us a real sense of connection back to those Bronze Age people.
In our million-year journey, we found out that our history goes back much further than we ever thought possible. And we've seen that over time, a complex society emerged in which the foundation stones of our own can be found. We've discovered a rich culture that has developed since those Ice Age artists first left their mark in the caves.
And what this journey shows us is that our prehistory is still a part of who we are today. And it's a part of our story that's only revealed with the help of archaeology. And so the digging continues.
We might be a small island, but we've got a big history. Everywhere you stand, there are worlds beneath your feet. And so every year, hundreds of archaeologists across Britain go looking for more clues. Who lived here, when, and how?
You can even see the architecture of the bone inside the jaw there.
Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, temples to treasure.
She's got a very cartoon-like face, hasn't she?
From Orkney to Devon, we're joining this year's quest on sea, land and air. We'll share all of the questions and find some of the answers as we join the teams in the field, digging for Britain. The Anglo-Saxons invaded and divided our island and ushered in the Dark Ages. This year, archaeology is offering fresh clues about the people who gave us England, the land of the Angles. Their warrior culture of swords and ornate burials. The physical evidence of violence in a time of blood feuds.
And this is sliced down the entire left side of his body.
And the mystery of the magnificent ring once worn by a wealthy Anglo-Saxon and never seen publicly until now. For almost 400 years, Britannia was a part of the Roman Empire, controlled by Rome's legions and strategically positioned forts. But by 410 AD, the troops had withdrawn, and raiders began to plunder the wealthy and defenceless land.
In the dying years of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Honorius received pleas from the British people. But with barbarians to deal with on the home front and the empire on the brink of collapse, he couldn't afford to send reinforcements. The people of Britain would have to look to their own defence.
The islands ceased to be part of a coherent empire, and the legacies of Rome were left to crumble. Crucially, written records all but disappeared, ushering in the so-called Dark Ages.
Britain was left wide open to bands of invaders from the continent. They included powerful tribes from France, Germany and Scandinavia, who we've come to know collectively as the Anglo-Saxons. And it wasn't long before they started to feel comfortable in their new home.
The departure of the Romans and the arrival of the first Germanic settlers is a shady period, recorded by just a sparse collection of texts. And even the archaeology that connects us to the people who lived through this period is scarce. Dorchester-on-Thames has thrown up some of the most important finds. And a new dig is hoping to add to the best evidence we have for this transition, a handful of artefacts that emerged from the fields around Dorchester over 100 years ago. They're stored here at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford.
The objects I'm about to see were found in the 19th century, but the fact that they are perhaps the best archaeological evidence we have of the earliest Anglo-Saxons in Britain gives us an idea of just how rare those physical traces of the early post-Roman period are.
These artefacts came out of the graves of 3 people buried in the 5th century. One is a burial which seems to be Roman, until you look more closely.
He was buried wearing a late Roman belt, known as a cingulum. It's really a badge of rank, of status, and this would have been made in Gaul in an imperial workshop. But the chap wearing it, of course, we know, lived and died in Britain. Now you might just think, well, why couldn't he just have been a Roman soldier? And this is certainly a badge of high rank in the Roman military. But it would be very unusual for a Roman soldier to be buried with his cingulum, with his belt. That's quite a Germanic style of burying your dead.
So he's got Roman objects, but he's buried in an un-Roman way with grave goods.
Absolutely.
Next to him, a woman's grave contained further evidence of this mixing of Roman and Saxon identities, a Roman belt buckle alongside 2 early Saxon brooches.
This is a so-called little cruciform brooch, and the other is the backplate of what's called an applied brooch, and that proves that she was not only wearing dress items from Germanic parts of the world, but that she was wearing a costume which is really Germanic.
So she's got a mixture of both Roman and Germanic style about her.
Absolutely. And the fact that she was buried next to or near to this chap, and that he was buried in a rather Germanic way, albeit with Roman items, suggests very strongly that these two were Germanic speakers from the other side of the North Sea.
Another grave added confirmation that these people were keen to signify themselves as both Roman and Saxon.
The question of what was happening to identities and how these were being reinvented and reformulated to meet these rapidly changing and rather traumatic circumstances is extremely interesting. And it's incredibly difficult and rare to find objects that can be firmly and definitively dated to the first half of the 5th century. I mean, whether Roman or Saxon, they're both rare. And these burials are some of the best evidence for how people were negotiating this very tricky period.
Connecting with the Dark Ages, even through archaeology, is a real challenge.
The artefacts from those graves scattered around Dorchester are fascinating. They date to this time of incredibly dramatic change in Britain. But they are just a handful of objects from a very small number of graves. We're not looking at a whole cemetery, let alone a settlement. So we are just glimpsing a very tiny part of the whole story.
At this year's dig amongst the garden allotments of Dorchester, archaeologists are hoping to add substance to our hazy picture of this time of upheaval. They're not just looking for artefacts, but for structures and features too, and in situ in their original context. Clues to make sense of two overlapping ways of life.
We tend to think of multicultural Britain being a modern phenomenon, but as we look back through history, we see a nation transformed by successive waves of people and ideas, and we neatly compartmentalise those cultures. But just how abrupt were the transitions? Roman Britain didn't become Anglo-Saxon overnight. It must have been more of a gradual process, a blending of two cultures. And archaeology allows us to examine the lives of people living through that transition. You've probably heard of the Venerable Bede. He was an 8th century Northumbrian monk and the most famous chronicler of his age. His ecclesiastical history of the English people is still our best source for the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, but we do have to treat what he writes with a little caution. He wasn't out to write an unbiased account, and it's strongly motivated by his Christian faith.
Bede tells us that Northumbria was conquered and settled by the Angles. The commanding site of Bamborough became the power base of this emerging tribal kingdom.
The castle we see today was largely rebuilt in the 20th century, but we know from archaeology that the site has been occupied for 5,000 years, going right back into the Neolithic. The castle sits on this massive rock, which is the strongest natural fortress on the coast of northeast England, and with commanding views over land and sea, Bamborough would become the seat of the Northumbrian kings.
But even at a royal site like Bamborough, we have to work hard to decipher the clues left behind by the Anglo-Saxon people who lived here.
So what have we got over here then, Graham?
Well, I mean, that's the one fortunate thing, that it's now exposed again so we can have a look at it.
Director of Archaeology Graham Young outlined where a Saxon timber hall would once have stood. The people who lived here constructed their buildings out of wood which has long since disappeared, leaving just an impression of the early fortress.
So So this really is negative archaeology, isn't it? You've just got the holes left where the timbers of this wooden building have just rotted.
Yes, where we've got enough evidence that we can reconstruct broadly what's above ground.
And we're standing right inside it and right on the edge of the rock here. So what would this building have been?
Well, we think it's to do with the gate, because the Anglo-Saxon entrance to Bamborough is just behind us. It's this cleft here. There's a marvellous little text from AD 774, and it describes these steps coming up through a cleft in a marvellous fashion, as the author says, and that must be it. There's nothing else at Bamborough that fits the bill.
So we're standing in the Middle Anglo-Saxon gatehouse to Bamborough Castle.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
We know that generations of Anglo-Saxons lived and worked at Bamborough over a prolonged period stretching hundreds of years. And yet even here, the footprints of the people are faint and hard to trace. Much of what we do know comes from sources like Bede, but what they tend to focus on is the high-status individuals, the kings and queens.
But there are people who made much less of an impression on Bede, people whose archaeological signature is much more difficult to trace. There's not much evidence of their buildings and certainly no buried treasure or magnificent graves. These are the ordinary people, the farmers and workers who populated the rural landscape.
And they are even harder to find. This is rural Northumberland, and we're right in the heart of Bede's home territory. Today we exploit this landscape for its natural resources of sand and gravel. But the same industrial machinery used to remove this material has uncovered rare and vital evidence of life in the so-called Dark Ages. Dr. Clive Waddington is leading the excavations at Lantern Quarry. Last year, his team unearthed rare traces of an ordinary early Anglo-Saxon village.
In front of me here, we've got a range of the finds that we got from the excavations at Lantern. So you can see, for example, this large stone here, which is a local sandstone. To the untrained eye, it might not look like a lot, but when you turn it over, you can see this lovely, smoothed, flat face. And that's got this perforation here in the centre. And this is a base of what we call a quern stone, which is a rubbing stone, which would have had a rotary quern on the top, another stone, that would have been used for milling grain to create flour.
Fragments of evidence reveal that the daily lives of these long-forgotten villagers would have involved milling, weaving and metalworking. But there are also more decorative items.
We found some glass beads, and you can see that these are really beautifully decorated, and we call them polychrome beads. They're multicoloured. These have been analysed and have been shown to contain traces of metal as well, which they'd used to colour the glass.
It's not treasure, but these everyday objects are shedding light on the workers, farmers and craftsmen who settled these rural plains. "300 miles down the coast, I'm about to meet the founding fathers of the invasion.
According to Bede, the Anglo-Saxon takeover began here on the coast of Kent with the arrival of two warrior brothers, Hengist and Horsa. They had been called in to help the British King Vortigern fight against his enemies, the Picts. And they were followed by wave upon wave of Germanic warriors who settled in Kent. But before long, those incomers would turn against their host and start to expand the boundaries of their new territory.
We don't know whether these two men actually existed, but it is clear that Germanic tribes were settling in Kent by the 5th century. We're in what may have been the territory of the first Anglo-Saxon warlords to settle here. Within 100 years of their arrival, their kingdom became the richest and most powerful in Britain. And this year, the skeletons of the people who lived here at this time have been emerging from the ground. A huge new highway is being built in Thanet, cutting straight through an area that's particularly rich in archaeology. A team from Oxford Wessex Archaeology has been called in to systematically excavate the area before the road can be laid.
There's a male individual, you can see by the very prominent eyebrow ridges, the very, very robust clavicles or collarbones.
As well as Saxon graves, archaeologists have found pits full of discarded shells, evidence of the food eaten by local settlers. They record their findings using satellite technology, eventually linking together all the graves and finds across the site. When the work is finished, all the information they've discovered here will form a detailed computerised map.
This excavation is absolutely massive, but it's just one of over 20 similar sites up and down the road scheme. Here we've got the two largest archaeological units in the UK coming together. There are over 100 professional archaeologists on site at any one time, making it the largest excavation in Britain this year.
And when they've finished, it will all disappear once more beneath the tarmac and cars that will eventually pass this way. But the archaeologists' work will continue. Analysis will be carried out on the skeletons. Eventually, we should know their age, their sex, and even the diseases they suffered from. It may take years, but archaeology isn't just about the digging. In 2008, another Anglo-Saxon cemetery was discovered 30 miles away, and it's only now, after nearly 2 years of research, that it's yielding remarkable insights into their world.
You might wonder what I'm doing in a car park outside a shopping centre in Sittingbourne, but I promise you, if you come with me through these doors, there's evidence of Anglo-Saxon Kent at the height of its powers.
Archaeologists have recovered 2,500 objects from around 230 graves at a site called the Meads. It's an enormous collection of clues dating back nearly 1,500 years. And processing this volume of material demands a unique approach.
Right, I think this must be it.
Dana Goodburn-Brown is an archaeological conservator. A year ago, she pioneered a radical new scheme, encouraging local volunteers to get involved with conserving the grave goods of people who may have been their ancestors.
So have you got people coming in who've never done anything like this before?
Oh yeah, no one's done anything exactly like this. No, they go through a training session and we have some practice pieces and then they start working on the real thing.
So what are the artefacts that you're working on here, Dana?
Well, this is a side view of this block, which seems to have this enormous brooch that's gilded. You can just see a little bit of gold coming out, so there's quite an intricate design going on there. But they could see that there was a series of rings. Now, if they lifted them out individually, you'd kind of just have a series of rings and you wouldn't really know what it was. But if you x-ray it as a block, you can see the relationship between one and the other. So that's this was something that went around the waist and probably keys or things might have hung off of it.
Dana's innovative project is opening up archaeology to everyone and is already proving popular.
We've had almost 10,000 people, and so you get people just dropping by. Some people come back and again, and we've been open for several months, and people are still just discovering us new. But don't you think it's great? Because loads of people can see it. Normally, conservation work goes on behind closed doors in a museum, and I love what I do, and it's really nice to share it with other people. I do have to stop myself sometimes and think, oh, this is 1,400 years old, and some craftsman, made this, and then someone wore it. It's quite special, yeah.
This is such a great example of community engagement. Anybody in this shopping mall, or they might be coming here to get their weekly shop or for a cup of tea, can pop in here and find out more about conservation, archaeology and local history. And if they're really interested, they can also volunteer.
But right now, I want to find out more about the artefacts from those graves.
Once they've been cleaned, you get a sense of the incredible craftsmanship that's gone into making these stunning objects. But what can they tell us about Anglo-Saxon life? Dr. Andrew Richardson of the Canterbury Archeological Trust has been interpreting these finds for over 2 years.
Andrew, these are wonderful objects just here. Are they brooches?
Yes. I mean, if you look at this one, this is what we call a plated disc brooch. It's basically a silver back plate with a gold front plate, then gold cell work, and then inlaid with garnets and very, very fine gold filigree wire.
It's also very delicately made.
It is. It's very highly skilled craft working, and you know, when you show this sort of thing to modern jewellers, they say that they would have to charge you an enormous amount of money to make a copy of this. The woman who owned this, who wore this, would probably have been at the top of the social scale in this community.
Incredibly high status, possibly even royal connections.
Definitely, I think, yeah.
Many of the people buried here by their grieving loved ones were adorned with magnificent pieces of jewellery. But the whole community is here, some buried with ordinary everyday items, like this iron knife.
If you think about the full range of objects we've got from this site, it's a huge investment in wealth in the ground. And it isn't recovered by them, it's only when we excavate it that it emerges into the light again.
The people interred here were part of a wave of settlers who'd come to make their mark, and nearly 1,500 years on, this cemetery is allowing us to glimpse how their society functioned.
A member of a powerful family dies, the family have to sort of reaffirm that that family still has power and status.
Because this certainly isn't costume jewellery, is it? I mean, this is the real thing. These are incredibly prized items.
This is the real thing. I mean, for their time, these are the top of the range jewellery that Anglo-Saxon England can produce.
We can suppose that these settlers were seen by the people already living here as invaders, and power in these times was wielded at the end of a sword. The cemetery bears witness to the importance of these weapons.
These are iron weapons. You've got spearheads, some of these spearheads inlaid with gold. You've got some decorated pyramid mounts from a sword belt.
They are amazing. Can I pick that up on its base?
Yes.
These exquisite items are over 1,000 years old, shaped in silver, inlaid with gold and topped with garnet. An extraordinary amount of effort has gone into crafting them.
I think they're real functional weapons, but they have a symbolic role. Young children, people who are severely disabled have been found buried with weapons, people who could never have used them in battle.
But still see themselves somehow as warriors.
They do. And I think, Anglo-Saxon culture, if you look at their poetry, their artwork, is very, very centred on warfare. It's about communicating a message about how they see themselves, how their families see the deceased in the funeral rite.
This amazing cemetery has let me back into a long-vanished world of Anglo-Saxon warlords and their much-loved wives and daughters. But the finds reveal that this was a world not just of warfare, but of feasting too.
What about these vessels here in the centre? They're rather intriguing.
Well, these are replicas of two cut glass cone beakers that were excavated in one of the graves at this site. They actually were found intact.
They're quite curious. You obviously couldn't stand that up on the table.
And I think these are, again, about communal feasting. I think these would be passed around the mead table. And these were found together in a grave of somebody with a sword, so perhaps a warrior, but certainly a man, and making a statement about perhaps his love of feasting, his love of mead. And it's ironic that the site is called the Meads, and they built a pub on it.
There is so little documentary evidence of early Anglo-Saxon society, so cemeteries like this
and those amazing grave goods offer us a really precious insight into that culture. And we start to be able to really focus on those people in the forgotten cemetery who themselves have long since faded from memory.
The idea of a Christian god was slowly gaining ground, but the pagan gods and goddesses were so deeply rooted in Anglo-Saxon culture that they wouldn't disappear overnight.
Christianity had returned, and like the invaders' own arrival, it would wash through the land, slowly but surely. One important aspect of this change is that by the 8th century, hundreds of minsters and nunneries had taken root all over Anglo-Saxon Britain.
The presence of these monastic communities moulded the entire future of the country, not least because they reintroduced widespread literacy. But apart from inside the very greatest of these religious houses, we have very little idea of what life was like in them. And that's what makes our next story so exciting. It's a rare opportunity to excavate and understand an Anglo-Saxon nunnery.
This is Berkeley Castle in modern-day Gloucestershire. Some of the castle dates to the 12th century, but its roots go back to the Christian conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. 17th century manuscripts speak of an Anglo-Saxon nunnery based within these grounds. And my friends from Bristol University are hoping to find its walls.
Looking good, guys. Looking good.
Dr. Stuart Pryor is co-directing the excavations. He's been able to put a date on some of the early structures that are emerging.
Just from this area here, we got this absolutely fantastic Anglo-Saxon strap end. Would have been on the end of a belt, and essentially it's in the shape of a little beast's head, a little dragon's head, and it's 9th century, and this was buried underneath the section of collapsed wall. So what that shows is that this building just here behind me has to be 8th or early 9th century, goes out of use, part of the wall collapses and seals this particular object. And essentially what this does is it gives us really good dating evidence to say this is Saxon and it's probably the nunnery.
Go off to there, 20 metres long, there.
Also directing the dig is Professor Mark Horton. He's finding some intriguing evidence of life inside the Anglo-Saxon nunnery.
The thing about Anglo-Saxon archaeology is that finds are incredibly rare, but we've been really lucky in finding an extraordinary quantity of material from this excavation. Metalwork like buckles and so forth, but maybe the most interesting are these three. This is a whetstone or a honestone. It probably would have hung around somebody's neck. And what it was used for was sharpening the knife that you would then sharpen the quill, which you would use for illuminating manuscripts, parchment manuscripts. So it's evidence of learning, of scholarship, literacy in the Middle Saxon period.
This find might be tiny, but it's a rare piece of physical evidence from a world in flux. A direct link to the revival of the written word throughout Anglo-Saxon Britain.
And this is an extraordinary piece. It's 8th century. Experts are really divided on what it really is, but I think it's what's called an astle. It would have had a bone pointer attached to one end. It would have been used to help reading manuscripts.
We know that these religious houses were not just places of worship, and as the digging continues, artefacts are gradually emerging from the ground that reveal that they were also focal points for commercial activity.
This was only found yesterday, just up there on that surface up there. And it is the earliest type of coinage used in Anglo-Saxon England. Dates from around 690 to around 740, is known as a skeet. Now, these things are very, very rare in Western Britain. They're found in some quantities in places like London and Ipswich and Southampton. But here in the West, they're virtually unheard of. And why it's so exciting, it tells us two things. One is that this place was a really important for trade and commerce. And the second reason is that this find puts the site back much earlier. The first documentary evidence we've got is in the middle part of the 8th century. This coin suggests that people here in the late 7th or early 8th century, right at the beginning of the conversion of this part of the world to Christianity.
The jewel in the crown of this Anglo-Saxon nunnery is a quite incredible object. No one seems to know exactly where it was found or how, and as far as I know, it's never been seen by the public before. So it's incredibly exciting that we're getting a chance to examine it.
That is fantastic, isn't it? Absolutely fantastic. It's actually bigger than I imagined.
It's an extraordinary thing. You've seen photographs or drawings, but when you see the thing itself, it is a wonderful, wonderful piece.
Leslie Webster, former curator of Anglo-Saxon archaeology at the British Museum, is astonished by the level of its artistry.
The craftsmanship, which is magnificent, and the sort of sheer quantity of gold that's gone into that.
So the question I've got to ask you, Leslie, how old is it?
Well, looking at the style of the piece, my feeling is that it belongs to the first third of the 9th century.
That's amazing.
Although we can't say for sure that the ring is Christian, it seems to be in the shape of a cross. Leslie suspects that it was worn by someone of very high status, but whether a bishop or a king, we just don't know.
The other question I really need to ask, obviously, is how do you think it was made?
Well, if I can seize it from you and get a closer look, it is absolutely superb. I mean, what we've got are 4 little animal creatures with pointy ears, long snouts. We've got little staring eyes, so it does look quite wolf-like, I think, or hound-like. Now, the filigree is also wonderful. It's so fine, and this lovely plaited work round the outside here. Very, very delicate. Again, that's quite an early-ish feature. The craftsmanship is just magnificent.
I can't believe that it survived in such amazing condition.
It's a very imposing, monumental ring, and in its whole character and style, it is unique.
Perhaps what's most interesting about this process of the re-Christianisation of Britain is that it's not one neat, linear story. Various missionaries arrived at different times from overseas, preaching the religions of the Celtic and Roman churches and attempting the conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxon kings. According to Bede, the Northumbrian king Oswald brought Christianity to his people. He called for a missionary to come from the Irish monastery on the island of Iona to convert his people. And when the monk Aidan arrived, Oswald granted him land to build a monastery on Lindisfarne over there. And the island became a cradle of Christianity.
This was the golden age of Northumbria. The royal capital of Bamborough would have been a magnet for people from across the kingdom, perhaps from across the world, who came here seeking fame, glory and gainful employment. 12 years ago, archaeologists located an extensive burial ground right next to the castle. Buried beneath the sand dunes were the remains of the residents of the Anglo-Saxon fortress of Bamborough. 100 skeletons were removed, just a portion of the total number believed to be buried there, and taken to Durham University for extensive analysis and research.
I'm an osteologist, someone who studies human bones, so I know how much these physical remains can reveal about the lives of past people. Archaeologists can tell a certain amount about ancient lifestyles by looking at objects that people have left behind. But long after we die, our bones hold an enormous amount of information about us.
Dr. Sarah Groves was involved in the excavations at Bamborough as a student and has been analysing the skeletons ever since. Her findings, due to be published next year, reveal some fascinating observations about the community living there.
The vast majority of the population did have quite bad teeth. Almost every individual, adults and children alike, had calculus on some of their teeth at least, and a really high proportion of them had caries as well, so that's tooth decay like this individual over here.
That hole's massive. It's taken away almost the entire top of the root there, just hanging onto the crown.
And the tooth next to it's completely gone. All we've got left is the roots remaining there.
Yeah.
We all know the pain of toothache, and these people didn't have modern drugs or dentists to ease their pain.
So why do you think there were such high rates of tooth decay and gum disease in this population?
Well, it's got to be something to do with the diet that they're eating, because it's affecting the whole population. So they must be eating something in their diet which is making them more prone to having these dental diseases.
And what could that be?
Well, I think that they must be eating quite a lot of meat, and we're seeing that from the archaeological material, and also eating a lot of flour, which is quite starchy and leads to sugars building up in the mouth. And also things like beer and wine and mead, all of which are quite sugary. And if you're drinking a lot of drinks like that, then that can also lead to tooth decay.
So rather bizarrely, these atrocious teeth are telling us that these people had quite a luxurious lifestyle.
Potentially, yeah.
And very rarely the stories told by individual skeletons contain clues about the way these people interacted with each other.
So is this a young person, a juvenile?
It's a young person, but I don't think it's really a juvenile. If you look at the state of fusion, it could be an individual who's between 10 and 16 years.
So looking here, the end of the radius in the forearm, that's still completely separate, and the ends of these finger bones as well are still separate.
But if you come up here and look at the teeth, you can see that actually they've got quite an adult dentition.
Do these teeth really belong with this skeleton?
They do, and if I hadn't been there during the excavation, I would have asked some questions about whether the skull did belong with the body, but it really does.
So we're looking at somebody who, from their teeth, it looks as though they're in their late teens, early 20s.
Yeah.
But from the rest of their bones, looks as though they're a child still.
Yeah.
A picture was emerging of a seriously disabled young man whose skeleton was ravaged by a debilitating condition.
And if you go right down there to the knee, you can see this right knee is really abnormal.
That's very odd. If I pick up the left knee as well for comparison, it just looks odd, doesn't it? It's very flared.
The knee joint is so malformed that it probably would have caused them problems with walking.
So this person had a congenital problem. They're very short. They probably look slightly deformed as well, but they're being buried in this high-status cemetery.
Yeah, and you can imagine that this is somebody who's potentially had to be cared for throughout their life, and yet they've still managed to reach early adulthood. So it suggests that as the population, their family, their friends are looking out for them, they're looking after them and affording them all the dignity and burial that everybody else in the cemetery was given. So it really shows you that this is a community so much like us now, caring for our sick, for our young people, for our elderly and for people with disabilities.
What's emerging is a different picture than we might expect of these so-called barbarians. We're starting to see them as people like us, members of families with friends and loved ones. And this isn't just the perspective that we're getting at Bamborough. 300 miles away to the southwest, Mark Horton has been researching a wonderful story of Anglo-Saxon royalty and a Wessex princess in love.
Inside Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire is a tomb dedicated to the first king of all England, Athelstan.
Athelstan, remarkably for his period, was not just somebody who wanted to expand the frontiers of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but also wanted to create alliances with Europe. And he systematically married off his sisters to all sorts of European rulers and princes and dukes.
The most successful alliance was between his sister Edith and Otto of Germany. Not only was this a politically astute move, but it also proved to be a great love affair.
Edith captured the imagination not only of Otto, but also his court and the people around her, because she was clearly stunningly beautiful. We know that Otto was very much devoted to her. He gave Magdeburg as a dowry this town on the frontier where she ended up being buried and where Otto himself ended up being buried later on.
During recent excavations in Magdeburg Cathedral in Germany, archaeologists set about exploring a 16th century sarcophagus dedicated to Edith.
It was thought to be a cenotaph, it was thought to be an empty tomb, but actually inside was found a lead casket, and in that was an inscription that said, "These are the remains of Queen Edith that were placed here in the year 1510. But in the Middle Ages, people constantly moved bones around. Relics was big business, so we really had to be certain that the bones were those of Edith and not some random person that had been scooped up in order to give this tomb some full credibility.
If these were her remains, it would be an extremely significant find, providing a direct link to the first King of England, Athelstan. And only science can help us determine whose body this is. Two of the teeth found within the coffin were sent off to be analysed at Bristol University. Dr. Alistair Pike planned to measure strontium isotopes in the teeth to find out where this individual grew up. Strontium is found in soil and absorbed by plants and animals. It finds its way into the bones and teeth of the people who eat them. Because teeth form during childhood, the strontium found in dental enamel reflects where a person was born and raised. And in Edith's case, this would have been in Wessex, the royal kingdom at the heart of an emerging England. As far as Alistair is concerned, the results from the Magdeburg tomb are conclusive.
I think that we can be 99% certain that we have the remains of Princess Edith, partly because the archaeological evidence suggests she's of the correct age, but using the strontium isotopes we can show that the results are consistent with someone who's been brought up on the kind of geology that surrounds the Winchester area, which is what the historical accounts suggest Princess Edith did.
Although Edith died over 1,000 years ago, she remains proof of our timeless fascination with princesses.
She came back to England in a way that in her lifetime she would never have expected to do, and she was an exceptional lady and somebody who really is at the fountainhead of sort of modern Europe, whose blood probably runs in the veins of most royal families in Europe today.
If Edith's bones tell a royal love story, the skeleton of one young man from Bamborough encapsulates the violence of the Anglo-Saxon years and bears witness to his untimely death.
This is his left arm, it's part of his left shoulder. You can see that this has been sliced away across the top of the shoulder.
And this is something which has happened in life rather than something which has happened to the bones in the ground.
Definitely. You can see if I put the rest of the shoulder together there, that we've got another piece of bone which has been sliced away.
So this has happened while these two bones are actually still together as a joint.
Yeah.
Something has sliced through them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's been a cut across his shoulder there. And you can see here on the pelvis, a great big slice of bone has been completely cut away.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Yeah.
Cleaved right across.
It has. So that's sliced away the front of the pelvis quite cleanly.
Mm. And all the way down to his left knee.
Really?
Down here. Again, sliced off right on the left-hand side.
A really clean slice.
So it's again taken off the side of his knee.
And this is sliced down the entire left side of his body.
Yeah, it's really exciting because it gives us the possibility of even reconstructing how he was standing when the blow was struck. So because of the way that his shoulder is cut, we can tell that his arm must have been slightly forwards and across his body.
Yeah.
So he's probably standing in a defensive pose.
Yeah.
So he's actually involved in the fight which happened, which led to the end
and
of his
it's
death.
left side, which makes sense if you've got a right-handed aggressor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and potentially somebody who's coming from a little bit above him as well.
Do you think that he might have been a warrior?
It is possible, even though he's quite small. We know that men in the Anglo-Saxon period started their careers quite early, so we have evidence for boys as young as 7 being sent to monasteries to train as monks. And we know that the elite started training with weapons from quite a young age as well. So from maybe around 7 or 8, he might have started learning how to use weapons.
So this is a young man who had a very tough, physically demanding, but very short life. By looking at skeletons like these, we can tell so much more about past societies. And new technologies are allowing us to get at evidence that's locked away inside their bones and teeth, about diet or even where they grew up. But when you look at the bones laid out like that, the skeleton of that young man, for instance, who died with that horrific injury, you realise there are also much more personal stories to be told.
The warrior kings of Northumbria ruled Bamborough at sword point for hundreds of years. And they left us one final reminder of their turbulent times, almost unrecognisable now. These swords are the ultimate symbols of Anglo-Saxon power.
These are quite magnificent items, aren't they?
They're both, I mean, obviously they're corroded now, but when we x-ray them, we can see the deep structure, and they're pattern welded, which means that they're made out of a series of rods welded together with a blade added to the outside. This one is particularly fine. You can see that it actually survives. There's a lot of metal in it. It's very strong, very coherent. This has 6 billets in the core of the blade.
So this would have been a high-status sword?
Definitely. I mean, 6-stranded swords are very, very rare. There are very few in Western Europe. So the likelihood is that we're looking at something that may even be more than just an aristocratic warrior. This may have been genuinely an heirloom of the royal house. It may have been carried by kings.
And looking at this sword, I can't help but remember back to the skeleton from the cemetery here, who was obviously a young man who died at the hands of somebody wielding a weapon just like this.
The royal swords, and indeed the entire site of Bamborough, are fitting symbols for the whole of Anglo-Saxon Britain. There are still so many unanswered questions, and the mysteries will remain a challenge for archaeologists and historians to unlock for many years to come. But it does offer us tangible connections too.
So what have I learned? Well, in many ways, these people were just like us. They had holes in their teeth, some were healthy, others marked by disease and cared for by their communities. But this was a time of great unrest and violence. Weapons became symbols of status, and people died by the sword. The struggle for power played out across all levels of society, and even the dead were co-opted, buried with treasures of gold and precious stones whose real value seemed to be as badges of identity. These people may not have left us detailed records of their lives, but archaeology is bringing them within our reach, and the digging goes on.
We might be a small island, but we've got a big history. Everywhere you stand, there are worlds beneath your feet. And so every year, hundreds of archaeologists across Britain go looking for more clues. Who lived here, when, and how?
You can even see the architecture of the bone inside the jaw there.
Archaeology is a complex jigsaw puzzle, drawing together everything from skeletons to swords, temples to treasure.
She's got a very cartoon-like face, hasn't she?
From Orkney to Devon, we're joining this year's quest on sea, land and air. We'll share all of the questions and find some of the answers as we join the teams in the field, digging for Britain.
For me, the Tudor age conjures up images of magnificent kings and queens, daring adventurers, and an explosion of literature under writers like William Shakespeare. But this period was about much more than just those personalities. It was a time of enormous political, social and economic change which heralded the beginning of modern Britain. And I'm hoping that archaeology can offer us fresh insights into the Tudor world and even provide us with glimpses of the everyday lives of those who witnessed that momentous era.
I'm searching for the vanished world of Tudor Britain.
It's just beautiful.
I get hands-on with discoveries at Shakespeare's house.
I want to find Shakespeare's sock. I so want to find Shakespeare's socks.
Learn about the popcorn of Tudor theatre. And investigate a mysterious wreck from this age of exploration and trade. My journey begins in the heart of London with a love story and the birth of British theatre.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Perhaps the most famous line from the greatest love story ever written, and I'm sure, like me, you can remember the first time you read or watched Romeo and Juliet. But the very first time those words were spoken was here, at the newly discovered Tudor Theatre in London's Shoreditch.
By a remarkable coincidence, as this site was being cleared to make way for a new theatre, the remains of a much older theatre were discovered. It wasn't just any old theatre, but London's original Tudor playhouse, where Shakespeare first became an actor and began his career.
Morning, Joe. Hello.
Good morning. Jo Lyon of the Museum of London Archaeology Service is supervising the dig. Her team have just 6 weeks left to excavate the site and learn all they can before it's covered over.
So this is the very first place where Shakespeare worked as a playwright?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much here. There's literally metres of Tudor archaeology.
Really?
This is, actually, it is the most important site I've ever done in my life.
The dig is a real jumble of medieval, Tudor and later archaeology.
A few bits of glass and pots coming out.
And they think they've discovered the remains of a pub, which may have been part of the theatre complex. But what's really exciting the archaeologists lies in the far corner, the remains of one small but significant section of the theatre's floor.
Now we're standing exactly as an audience member would have stood back in the day. We're standing at the back of the yard. You can buy a cheap ticket and go and stand in the yard and watch the play, or you can sit in the galleries. And you'll see that the floor slopes slightly in that direction, and that's on purpose so that you can have a better view.
So that people at the back can still see over the heads of the people in front. And what about this wall here? Is this the foundations of a wall?
So this is the edge of the galleries. The galleries would be coming up behind us, off of this foundation wall, and we'd be stood at the back. And that means the stage would have been sort of over there, perhaps 10 metres away from here.
Isn't that amazing? 400 years ago, there were people standing exactly where we are, watching Shakespeare.
Looking at a young William Shakespeare performing Romeo and Juliet. You know, for me, that's amazing.
It does send a bit of a shiver down the spine, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're discovering fragments of pottery all the time, but amongst them are some really interesting objects, including this almost intact wine goblet, which dates to exactly the time of the theatre.
That's really lovely. That's such a gorgeous colour.
It could perhaps have been a stage prop or belonged to a theatre goer.
Just a couple of days ago, we had this amazing find, which is an absolutely complete jug. And there's not a flaw in it. There's no chip out of it, nothing. So they're called Bellarmine or Bartman jugs.
Yeah.
And they all have this bearded male face on them.
Yes,
which
it's
is,
great.
yeah, it's really distinctive.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's just
Yeah,
fantastic.
it's beautiful. It's got such a nice feel to it as well, hasn't it?
So what would this have been used for? What would have been in it, do you suspect?
Beer.
Beer. So possibly someone buying their beer, making their way to the theatre.
But yeah, why not? It could work.
Well, the digging that's going on all around me will finish in just a few weeks' time, and then the site will be handed over to the developers, and very fittingly, a new theatre will be built here. We're just so privileged to get this glimpse into Shakespeare's world, because despite the fact the Tudors were so influential in shaping modern Britain, they're not an easy bunch to track down. In later centuries, many of the old Tudor buildings fell out of fashion and were either completely renovated or pulled down, erasing much of our Tudor past. And since Victorian times, the fashion for deep cellars has obliterated many traces from earlier periods beneath the ground as well. So today, there are only fragments of Tudor Britain left behind, even in this, the capital of their kingdom, London. The River Thames was of vital importance to the Tudor kings and queens. London was firmly placed at the centre of their political power, and they ruled their kingdom from a series of palaces dotted along the river. Westminster, however, was not the real seat of Tudor power. That was several miles downriver, at Greenwich.
This palace was located on the riverfront, at the site of what is now Christopher Wren's iconic Old Royal Naval College.
If I asked you to name a Tudor palace, chances are you'd say Hampton Court. But the palace that once stood here was much more important and much more interesting. But it's been largely erased from public consciousness.
We've only just begun to understand the grand scale of the palace here, thanks to a series of digs over the last 30 years. Julian Boucher has been closely involved with revealing this forgotten Tudor world.
The Tudor palace, built by Henry VII, was one of the greatest of the new palaces of the time. And because of Henry VIII himself, who was in fact born here. He was born probably over in this corner here.
Right.
He married his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in the church of the Friary, just over here. He married Anne of Cleves right over at the other end at the private chapel. His daughter Elizabeth was born over here. It's very connected with Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth. They're all here. You can almost feel them around here.
Archeological finds made at the palace can tell us more about the lives of the Tudor kings and queens who lived here.
We've got a Tudor tile here that came from the Chapel Royal that we excavated in 2005. And it's the private chapel of the palace. It's on this floor, if you like, that Henry married Anne of Cleves.
Right.
The Tudors used a potent new symbol to stamp their authority on Britain, the Tudor rose.
That looks very Tudor to me, this rose. What is it?
It's a lead cast decoration Tudor rose with even traces of gilt around the side, and there would actually have been these all over the ceiling.
So these would have been colourful?
Rooms. Yes, indeed, yes.
It's a real stamp of Tudor identity, isn't it?
Absolutely. Saying, this is our palace, Greenwich Palace, the centre of England. We're here to stay. This is Tudor, this is us.
There's nothing of those buildings remaining up here now, but down amongst the shifting mud and gravel of the Thames foreshore, there are tantalising traces of Greenwich's Tudor past.
On the foreshore in front of where the palace once stood, a team from the Thames Discovery Programme think they may have found a structure that linked the palace to the river. Leading the team is Natalie Cohen.
Natalie.
Hello.
Hi. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
So what have you got here down on the shore?
We've picked up a whole series of timbers running along the front of this wall here. We think it's part of a jetty structure that may have related to the Royal Palace, sort of immediately behind us here.
So what would this have been in the jetty?
It appears to have been part of the base plate, I would think, pegged to the foreshore or pegged to another piece of base plate through those peg holes there.
You can just imagine the royal barge landing here and Henry VIII or Elizabeth disembarking with a fanfare surrounded by coaches. This now mundane stretch of the river was once the most exclusive in London.
it's not just structures like piers and jetties that can be found here on the Thames foreshore. There's archaeology literally everywhere you look. There's pottery, bone, shell, fragments of clay pipe. It's probably one of the richest veins of archaeology anywhere in Britain.
There are other people looking for clues here on the foreshore, the mudlarks. They have a special licence that allows them to dig for the historical objects that litter the Thames beaches. Over the years, they've made some remarkable discoveries. You might think they'd be using metal detectors, but in fact they work by hand because the sheer quantity of metal here makes detectors useless.
We've got an Elizabethan fastener there.
Yeah.
If you can imagine on your jacket, this would actually fasten like that.
Ah, like hooks and eyes?
Yeah. It's a fastener. So that is actually
so that's
a fastener.
Elizabethan?
It's Elizabethan. And then on top of that, these are in abundance down here. These are Tudor pins. A woman of distinction had 1,000 pins on her. I think Elizabeth I had 2,000 pins on her. Now,
doing what?
Well, for hair, for clothing.
Yeah.
An Elizabethan ruff had 150 pins plus on it. And these are Tudor lace ties, so exactly the same as you get on your shoelaces.
Oh, yeah.
Like on jackets, on shirts and stuff, where you'd have crisscrosses of like leather thongs and stuff. These would be on the end, so they could be threaded.
Well, the tide has come in now and covered up all of that archaeology on the Thames foreshore. It's disappeared, very much like Greenwich Palace itself has disappeared from public consciousness. But we know now, not just from history, but from archaeology too, that this was the spiritual home of the Tudors. The raising of the Mary Rose in 1982 was one of those rare events that's etched into the national consciousness. But the recovery of the hull, along with thousands of artefacts and hundreds of bones, was just the beginning of a 30-year project that's still going on today.
OK, well, if you'd like to come in here, Alice, this is going into our holiest of holies, our Holy Grail.
Christopher Dobbs has been closely involved in planning the new Mary Rose Museum, which for the first time will display the objects and the hull together.
Baskets and barrels and chests and fantastic bowls and plates. But this one, this absolutely superb bowl here, I think that this is probably a mess bowl.
Right,
and to actually serve individually into plates or bowls to 500 down in the ovens would have been just too difficult.
Yeah.
So they almost certainly transferred the food from one whole mess into a bowl like this. And that then led us to possibly identify this. I mean, it might look like a very minor object, but it could well be a mess tag. So you'd almost have like a luggage label, because they may have cooked actually in cloth bags in the cauldron, because that would mean you could keep all the food for 8 or 10 people together, and you could tie like a luggage label onto this. And that's what they were used in later wrecks.
Something's been tied
Yes,
down there.
it was definitely a tag of some sort.
Yeah.
It's almost overwhelming being surrounded by the worldly goods of 500 men, all interred in one catastrophic moment. There's everything from dice to musical instruments.
Look at that one, that's absolutely perfect.
And even the combs they use to get rid of their lice.
I mean, look at that. I can't believe that's a Tudor dagger handle, knife handle. It's just beautiful.
Even mundane objects like grindstones used to make flour on board have a haunting quality to them.
Many people think that the Mary Rose is something, the project is something that finished 20 years ago or something, but it doesn't, you know. Daily we're finding out new things and new stories and being able to tell things in new ways.
There's just a phenomenal number of objects recovered from the Mary Rose. Look at these beautiful longbows, there are hundreds of them. And of course, we don't just have the personal objects that these people carried around with them. We do actually have the skeletons of the people themselves.
During the excavations, the remains of 179 individuals were carefully recovered. As an anatomist, these bones provide me with a unique insight into the lives of these men.
I can see some interesting things.
I'm meeting Dr. Alex Hildred, who's a curator at the Mary Rose Trust, to uncover the stories of these men.
There were particular places which must relate to blocking of access routes
to getting off the ship, where you've got 20 or 30 individuals and far more bones than you can actually put into those individuals.
People fighting to get off the sinking ship.
Especially as there was netting across the only really open bits of the ship, had anti-boarding netting. I think it would have been horrendous trying to get off the ship. Gun ports were so tightly fitted to their guns that you wouldn't have been able to get through those easily. And
Did anybody manage to get off?
About 35 survivors, but then people didn't swim naturally. It was quite rare to be a swimmer, so 35 survivors.
35 out of how many were there?
415 listed.
The men on board were there to fight, and many of them would have wielded longbows, which were amongst the most feared weapons in the medieval world. One skeleton in particular provides a direct link to these devastating bows.
This chap was found pretty much by himself in the hold of the ship, in the bow. But just literally above him was a wrist guard with the arms of England on it. So, you know, it's interesting to suggest with one of the tallest individuals, who's very robust, that, you know, he may well have been an archer, and that's what's been suggested in the past.
He's incredibly well built. Now, some of that's going to be genetic, but some of it might be what he's actually doing with his body as well. But the skeleton has got this rather interesting condition at the shoulder where the tip of his shoulder has failed to fuse. I mean, what we're looking at is the end of the scapula, which starts off as a separate little bone like this, but should fuse during development. But here, in an adult skeleton, it has stayed separate. And there's been a suggestion that this is to do with heavy use of the shoulder.
Well, archers, well, anybody, any male in England at the time would have to shoot a bow at least once a week from the age of about 7. So if somebody was good, needless to say, they probably would have been encouraged to do it more than once a week.
Knowing that archery was widespread, I suspected other skeletons might reveal a different telltale sign of the damage that archery might cause.
So this here is evidence for what we call rotator cuff disease, so this frilly bone here with the little holes in it, the pitting in it, which looks like osteoarthritis. Now, it's not osteoarthritis because it's not happening on the joint surface, but it's happening where the muscles insert that stabilise the shoulder. And this is associated with stress and strain on those tendons. We get rotator cuff disease happening in young people when they are cricketers or baseball pitchers.
Or archers, maybe.
Maybe. It is such a privilege to look at the bones from the Mary Rose. It's something that I've wanted to be able to do for a long time. And I think coming here and looking at the collection as well, I'm completely bowled over by it. There are so many objects and so well preserved from the wreck. And they really do make sense when you look at them all together, when you've got the ship and all those objects within it and the people themselves. We've got this very complete picture of the lives of these mariners in the Tudor period. I'm in West Wales on my way to the site of Strata Florida Abbey, which in its heyday in the medieval period was among the most important religious places in the whole of Britain.
Strata Florida stood in the shadow of the wild and remote Cambrian mountains, far from the bustling towns and cities of Tudor Britain. It was founded by Cistercian monks striving for a life of hard work and solitude. Not much of their great abbey remains today. All that can be seen are the desolate ruins of the abbey's once grand church and its famous archway. But in a field nearby, a team from the University of Wales Trinity St David have spent the last few summers slowly uncovering the remains of this Cistercian monastery. What they've found lying hidden in the landscape is truly remarkable. Leading the team are Professor David Austin and Dr Gemma Bizant. They've undertaken a geophysical survey which has revealed evidence of the buried abbey site.
So is that where we are just there?
This is where we are here, in this corner.
We've got the church.
The Abbey church is
over there.
over there. But also, I mean, there's an enormous building complex just behind you, and another really large complex over by the river there.
Huge industrial activity down here. You see these enormous signals there.
So what do you think this is?
Well, we think it's ironworking because we've excavated an iron forge over here. So it's the whole of this southern area at some point is processing metal coming out of their mines, and their mines are just up on the hill slope over here.
It's amazing to think that this agricultural landscape was so busy.
Yeah.
It full of industry, full of people.
Exactly. You know, this would have been a really busy place.
This summer, the team are hoping to reveal the full scale of the Abbey and also to find evidence of the great events it bore witness to.
I hadn't realised how important Strata Florida was, but the whole of this valley would have been home to a massive monastic community, and we're just starting to get a real feeling for the extent of that from the excavations here.
The excavations have uncovered the foundations of a huge stone building, which the team believe is the Great Gatehouse guarding the entrance to the Abbey. Gradually, the dig has begun to reveal its original layout. You can just make out the plan of the building from the remaining walls. The gatehouse would have dominated this flat valley floor, and the road the gatehouse guarded would have stretched to the Abbey Church in the distance. You really get a sense of how visiting dignitaries would have felt, confronted by this imposing structure. The gatehouse dig has yielded some evocative finds which hint at the piety of the monks who once called this place home.
We've got a nice find from inside the gatehouse. This piece of bath stone that probably would have lined the archway.
Yeah.
And you can see here, if you look very carefully, an incised cross.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's almost like a good luck talisman. We think people would have just touched that as they passed through the gateway on their way into the Abbey Church.
Other finds remind us of the great wealth the monks enjoyed, which they lavished on their grand buildings.
Are these floor tiles here?
These
They're
are floor
lovely.
tiles here, yes. You can see this nice one shaped like a griffin or a dragon, if you like. You can see the wings and the head. And we know it was an impressive building. It was a large building, so maybe it had this large, impressive floor.
You tend to think of Cistercian monks seeking out solitude, finding some remote corner of the Welsh countryside. Now, it certainly is that today, but it wouldn't have been like that in the medieval period. And those monks were incredibly wealthy landowners, controlling all the agricultural land around here, as well as the lead mines. And the wealth they accumulated would be their downfall.
After divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Henry had set himself on a collision course with the Catholic Church. The Pope excommunicated the king, and Henry responded by declaring himself the head of his own church. The break with Rome was final.
After Henry's schism with Rome in 1534, the time had come to finally crush the abbeys, which Henry's ministers had described as bastions of corruption and papal power, and rather conveniently, the king could seize the monastery's wealth for himself.
Here at Strata, Florida, and across the country, the Crown seized the monks' wealth and land. The king then sold off the monastery's assets quickly to free up much-needed revenue. The greatest beneficiaries of this process were the middling gentry, who now had the lands to create new estates. Evidence for this lies just beside the abbey ruins.
So what have we got here?
Well, this is part of the arrangements of the gentry house, which lies behind us here. It's now a farmhouse, but it was a gentry house, probably originally built around 1600.
And when you say a gentry house, who were these gentry? Who would have been living in that house?
It would have been a member of the Stedman family. They come with the Earls of Essex here in the early part of the 16th century. And the Earls of Essex acquired the lands of the abbey, cheap off the crown, and then the aristocrats sell on to the local gentries, and so this money filters down through the system.
And indeed, a lot of the houses in the surrounding area used the abbey as a quarry and took stone from there.
So it's not surprising that, in fact, the abbey is in such a ruin and there's not much of it surviving. It is surviving, but it's not there, it's here.
No, it's a quarry. It's an asset. We're in the early stages of capitalism. You don't leave assets lying around the landscape doing nothing. You strip them.
Due to the actions of Henry VIII, the landscape and belief system of Britain had changed forever. Strata Florida represents this change in microcosm. A new Protestant church was built right next to the ruins of the Catholic Abbey.
It's a sweet little church. It's a bit of a contrast to what the Abbey church would have been like.
Yeah. Abbey church, massive, hugely ornate, full of sculpture, full of vivid paint. And you come in here and this plainness and this simplicity is a wonderful counterfoil to all that glory and magnificence that lay in that church on the other side of the wall. It's very much a secular power. And that's one of the great marks of Protestantism. There is an organised church, but it's a state church, and the head of that church now is a secular authority, is a secular king. That's what Henry VIII delivers.
We can only guess at what the monks who once lived and worked here must have made of the dissolution. Their lives were torn apart and their world turned upside down.
The ruined monasteries that lie scattered across the British landscape provide a lasting reminder of the dissolution. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in British history. Not only did ordinary people find themselves living in a Protestant country, they also witnessed an unprecedented redistribution of wealth and land that would have far-reaching consequences for our island nation. It was during the Tudor age that we began to look beyond our own shores to the New World. After Columbus discovered America in 1492, waves of daring merchant adventurers set out on voyages of discovery to find new lands and boundless wealth. And those voyages are all the more remarkable when you consider that those men were travelling to the very edges of the known world.
The remains of one of these merchant ships is now being preserved at a saltwater lake in Portsmouth. Today, a team of divers is going to inspect it for signs of decay.
Well, this is what we've got to do today, guys.
Gustav Milne has played a key role in researching this ship.
Time waits for no man. What are you waiting for?
The ship was originally discovered in a channel in the Thames estuary during dredging and then moved here for safekeeping. If the ship was simply brought to the surface, it would soon begin to rot away. By studying the remaining timbers, it's been estimated it was a sizable merchant vessel of up to 300 tons and 80 feet in length. Perhaps surprisingly for a merchant vessel, they discovered 4 cannon at the wreck site. You can just make out one of the surviving gun ports. These ships carried merchant adventurers across the globe and needed protection in uncharted waters. Despite all we know about this wreck, its precise identity remains a mystery. However, a vital clue was found on one of the recovered cannons. A team from the Royal Armouries, led by Phil McGrath, discovered an intriguing link with the most powerful financier of the Tudor age, Sir Thomas Gresham.
The first thing that struck us was on the surface, quite clearly we have the T and the G for Thomas Gresham, and then above that we have the family crest in the form of a grasshopper.
Gresham's legacy can still be seen in London's financial heart. The dissolution of the monasteries released a huge amount of capital into the British economy, and that money eventually filtered down to entrepreneurs like Sir Thomas Gresham. It was men like Gresham who would help create the City of London that we know today. He founded the Royal Exchange, which was the forerunner of today's stock exchange. Sir Thomas Gresham worked directly for the Tudor kings and queens and even helped save Britain from bankruptcy by manipulating the foreign exchange markets. So the Gresham ship provides us with a tangible link back to the beginnings of modern capitalism. In the labs of University College London, they're working to discover more about the ship's role and her crew. Many of the artefacts recovered are metallic, and during a reaction with salt water, some of these objects have become encased by what archaeologists call concretions. By removing these concretions, the team hope to reveal the secrets of the Gresham ship.
Processing this work is dirty, messy, heavy work. We're using large tools, not delicate scalpels, and we're creating a lot of mess.
A huge variety of objects have emerged from within the concretions.
Now this, I think, is the most exciting find that we've discovered from the concretions. And what we have here, we have an additional cannon, which is represented by this powder chamber.
That is fantastic. That really is a find and a half. Worth all that bashing.
We thought we had 4 cannons. We have an additional powder chamber now, which suggests that there was another cannon on board.
Their research has shown just how heavily armed this ship was. And it's also revealed the cargo, which needed such formidable protection. They've discovered numerous metal ingots, some of which are solid lead. These would have been very valuable and vital for industry and warfare.
This is the first time I've seen these ingots, and these are, one, extremely heavy. Just get a load of that.
No, I can't, sorry.
I can't lift that. And we've got 3 of a cargo of potentially 2,000 of these ingots. Imagine 2,000 of those in a ship. That is a robust vessel.
But some of the most moving objects are those that tell us about the ship's crew.
The small metal finds associated with the concretions, I think, have been particularly exciting. We have a couple of spoons, silver spoons, tableware, possibly from the captain's table. They're fairly high-status objects. So what do you make of this?
Wow. Is this his candle holder?
The other possibility is as a salt holder.
The intriguing finds which the team at UCL carefully smashed out of those concretions provide us with a snapshot into bustling Tudor London. You can just imagine the Gresham ship sailing up the Thames, laden down with iron, tin and lead. These ships brought prosperity to the city, and they fuelled whole new sectors of the economy, like entertainment, which sprang up in a big way to help the Londoners spend their hard-earned cash.
This is Stratford-upon-Avon, the birthplace of a man who would directly benefit from London's new prosperity, our most celebrated playwright, William Shakespeare.
His plays and poems are the most well-known and widely studied works of literature ever produced, and his legacy is immense. Our everyday language is peppered with words and phrases from his writing. But despite all that fame and influence, the man himself remains an enigma. Only a few fragments of evidence survive from his lifetime. This summer, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust are hoping that archaeology can shed some new light on this remarkable man. They're digging at the site of his last home, New Place.
We're nearly at the first stage.
Richard Kemp was involved in organising the dig and has brought me to the city's Guild Chapel. This medieval church would have stood right next door to Shakespeare's house, and today provides us with a fantastic bird's-eye view of the dig.
Now, Shakespeare's house basically occupied this space.
So what would the house have been like?
Well, according to the historic sources that we've got a C-shaped house around an open courtyard.
But there's not much evidence of this C-shaped house at the moment.
No, there isn't, because the whole thing was knocked down in 1702 by the construction of a Georgian mansion.
The area at the back of the site is exciting the archaeologists because it's here that the house's rubbish would have been buried. There's a real mix of archaeology here, and the team have found 14th century pottery right next to 18th century rubbish. An intriguing feature has emerged, a large, mysterious pit. Kevin Coles, the lead archaeologist on site, and Richard have conflicting theories as to what this is.
I think it's a pit that's obviously been used to burn something.
Right.
And we're digging it out now to see if we can find the bottom, where hopefully there's charcoal and lots of burning that we can find evidence for.
Richard has a more intriguing theory. He thinks it's a filled-in well.
If it is a well, it goes deeper, and the stuff's waterlogged. And when it's waterlogged, you get even more evidence preserved, or all the organics, like the socks. I want to find Shakespeare's sock. I so want to find Shakespeare's socks and shoes and stuff that, you know, gets thrown away and normally rots down.
Yeah, I suppose we're familiar with the idea that things survive in peat bogs, but equally well, things might survive in the bottom of a well.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, maybe this is just a pit, but if it is a well, it will take the team a while to get down to the waterlogged levels, where there could be surviving Tudor rubbish.
Have you ever done any archaeology before?
Nope.
Are you enjoying it?
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's absolutely wonderful.
Just being here, you really get a sense of the excitement and passion of everyone on site, all hoping to find something Shakespearean.
I mean, we don't do pot washing all the time. We do troweling as well.
But you can say fines processing. That's always
Fines
sounds
processing.
better.
It does.
Yes,
You're right.
Washing pots.
Yes,
Yes, it certainly does.
It pretty much gets no better than this, really. You normally dig sites which are Roman or Iron Age, and you can't really put yourself into the shoes of the people who lived and worked on that site. But the archaeology of this particular site is just all about one man, and it's his life and times, and you can really begin to feel you're linking to the person as we're excavating down through material which he would have walked on or threw away.
Yeah.
Kevin and the team have already made some fascinating discoveries.
We've got this stone roof tile here with the hole where the nail would have been to hold it in place, and that begins to build a picture of what the building may have looked like. So you've got fantastic yellow stone tiles on the top. We're also finding more sort of domestic household objects.
Is that a plug?
It is a plug. It is indeed a copper plug. Then we move on to more Tudor pottery now. So you've got this green glaze Tudor cooking pot with burning on the bottom.
So this pot was put over heat.
This was used. Yes, exactly.
You can see you can see the edge coming out there, almost like a skillet.
Exactly, like a frying pan, and that's perfectly in line with the sort of 16th century date that we're looking for, really.
Could have been used by Shakespeare.
You could be holding something that's been touched by William Shakespeare. Yep.
Shakespeare only lived here at New Place for around 20 years. Archaeologically speaking, finding traces of him is going to be like looking for a needle in a haystack, but nevertheless, it's so exciting to be able to dig here where we know he lived and where we imagine we might be able to get a closer glimpse of the bard himself.
This site was first dug by the Victorians in a time before archaeology was a rigorous modern discipline. Rather intriguingly, they built a number of puzzling walls and sealed brick boxes to preserve what they found. You can feel the buzz of anticipation as the team prepare to open one of these boxes.
Here we are basically excavating the cellar area. These are all these almost brick boxes. So we're just about to open the last one of them and see what we can find.
Really exciting.
So shall we?
So it's like the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb.
Almost.
I know how Howard Carter felt. That's the side, I think.
It's thrilling to think that after 150 years, its contents will be revealed.
Snails have got in there.
Snails?
Well, not exactly like Tutankhamun's tomb, but there is something else in here.
That's interesting.
So, Kevin, what do you think we've got here?
What I think we've got here is 1702 cellar walls of the property that replaced Shakespeare's house on this site. Whether any of these bricks are reused from Shakespeare's house, we'll have to look at.
So these could be Tudor bricks, but they've been reused?
Yes, basically the thinness of these bricks seem to suggest that these were quite old. So these
Right.
might be 16th century bricks, Tudor bricks.
It definitely feels like we're getting closer, but Shakespeare seems to be just out of reach here at the dig.
Shakespeare didn't leave much evidence behind for historians, so the few documents that survive have proved vital in piecing together what little we do actually know about his life.
I've come to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust archives to see a key piece of evidence that tells us both about New Place and the man himself. Dr. Paul Edmondson is a leading authority on Shakespeare's life and works.
This is known as the New Place Fine, and it established Shakespeare's legal entitlement to the property, in which Shakespeare pays £60 for. And because the purchase deed was usually half the cost of the overall property, we suspect that therefore Shakespeare paid £120 for New Place.
That must have been a decent amount of money back then.
Quite a lot in those days. Just remember that a schoolmaster at that time earned £20 a year. It just kind of gives you the scale of the investment. And a kind of juicy fact about this particular purchase is that the person who lived there before Shakespeare was murdered by his son, Fulk Underhill, who was executed at
Really?
Warwick, yeah. And the surviving son, Hercules Underhill.
Fantastic
Isn't
name.
that fantastic?
Yeah.
And is the one who's involved in this purchase deed. It's the biggest privately owned residence in Stratford.
Yeah. And Paul, even though this isn't a document that Shakespeare wrote himself,
No.
we can imagine that he would have held it in his hand.
Oh, absolutely. He saved money on it too, because you'll notice that there's a space here for a grand capital letter, which has never been filled in because it'd been more money, which is good to know. Like, paid my 60 quid, that's
Yes.
enough, thanks very much.
Well, the team haven't found anything that can change our understanding of Shakespeare just yet, but I do feel I've got a sense of this man, his wealth and his thriftiness. And there's another place where clues about his life can be found.
Like many young men of his time, Shakespeare left his home in the provinces and came here to London to seek his fortune. The streets weren't exactly paved with gold, but nevertheless, it was here, in the thriving city, that he made his name.
We've already seen Shakespeare's earliest theatre being excavated, but discoveries at the Rose and the Globe playhouses in the late 1980s have helped build a picture of the world in which he lived and worked.
This very ordinary-looking building contains an extraordinary archaeological collection. It's the Museum of London's Archives, and it's the largest stores of its kind in Europe, housing over 750,000 individual objects, including those found at the Rose and the Globe playhouses.
I'm here to see Julian Boucher, who has led the research into these playhouses.
Julian, we meet again.
Hi, Alice.
Hello, hello.
Good to see you again. Through this labyrinthine.
Here, finds from across London are brought to be washed, dried and catalogued. The same system is used for the thousands of finds from the Rose and Globe digs.
Come in here, where it'll all get dried out under control.
After 20 years' work, Julian and his team have just published their findings. The artefacts recovered offer us fascinating clues about life in Shakespeare's theatres.
Well, the interesting thing really about the playhouse is that it's the beginning of modern theatre. These are purpose-built venues, and you had to go through a door and pay money, and this is what you paid. You paid a penny to get in to the main door, so you could stand in the centre, or you could pay another penny to get into the galleries around the edge, and a third one to sit at the top where you get the best view. So they all went into one of these ceramic money boxes, of which we've just got the lids.
So this would have been a completely sealed pot?
Oh, yes, like piggy banks. They've got a little slot in the side there where the coin's going to go. And at the end of the day, they would have gone back to the sort of management area, if you like, which is where they were smashed. That's why we have the pieces. And the whole lot, all the money emptied into a box, and that's the box office.
And is that where we get the term box office from then?
Absolutely,
These
yes.
Tudor theatres?
Yes. So a lot of the other evidence we're looking for is what people are consuming inside the building. We know about people who'd have the kind of the usherette's tray of pints of beer, even bottled beer.
Yeah.
And here we've got one of the most common comestibles that they've got are hazelnuts, found underneath the galleries around the edge.
So these hazelnuts are the popcorn and peanuts
Absolutely,
of the Tudor
yes.
era.
It's the Tudor popcorn. And of course, the other new comestible that we find in the theatres is the evil weed. Tobacco that had only been brought to Britain about 30 years before, in the 1550s or so. And these very typical Tudor pipes, and they're all very tiny because I think it's probably related to the price of tobacco.
Right.
You can't fit much in there.
So this is the new fad.
It is, and certainly quite popular.
As well as objects associated with the audience, some of the finds might relate to the actors themselves.
This is a brush, a very tiny, delicate brush made of bone, a nice little bone handle, with just a fragment of its bristles left. The exciting thing about this is it's just the sort of brush that actors would use for makeup. And don't forget that Shakespeare was an actor as well. So we're looking at Shakespeare and his fellows probably rushing off to do the final bit of makeup before walking onto the stage, which is really rather nice.
Isn't that lovely?
But these stores also contain evidence of Elizabethan London's darker side. Outside the city walls, prostitution, gambling and brutal blood sports were commonplace.
Next to the playhouses on Bankside, there were animal baiting pits.
So right alongside the playhouses?
Yeah, next to the playhouses. And they had bears, horses that were being baited by very powerful mastiff dogs like this. This was found in one of the bear baiting rings next door to the Rose.
So do you think it would have been a different class of person that was going to the bear baiting and the theatre?
I'm afraid not. They regarded it all as part of an afternoon's entertainment. One of the interesting pieces we found is a bone. It's a femur, the upper thigh bone of a European brown bear. In fact, we found teeth marks here, which our faunal osteologists have identified as precisely the sort of teeth made by a mastiff.
And the playhouses and the bear baiting arenas were outside the city?
The city was becoming under increasingly puritanical jurisdiction, and these sorts of activities were slightly frowned upon by the city fathers. So they're very much situated outside the city, particularly in areas like Bankside. The plays, the blood sports, the brothels, the drinking dens, the gambling dens.
The seamier side of Tudor life.
Yes.
The archaeology of Tudor London gives us a real insight into the city during this period and allows us to peer more closely at all levels of society, from kings and queens down to the ordinary people. It's like Shakespeare's plays in that respect. We get to peer inside the royal palaces and look at the rabble who attended the bear baiting arenas and the playhouses.
The digs and dives I've visited across Britain this year have allowed me to reach out and touch the men and women who lived during the Tudor age. The wealthy monks who once thrived in the now desolate ruins of Strata, Florida, and suffered the full fury of Henry VIII. The newly rich merchants and financiers who sent ships and crews to trade at the edges of the known world. And the men who fought and died for their king as the Mary Rose went to the bottom of the sea.
Isn't that amazing?
And most thrillingly of all, Shakespeare himself.
Sends a bit of a shiver down the spine, doesn't it? But as always, archaeology has unearthed just as many questions as answers, and so the digging for Tudor Britain continues.